Shortly before the outbreak of World War II, the Japanese were already preparing to conquer the Pacific. However, the United States stood in their way. The Japanese Imperial Navy then resolved to build the most powerful battleship ever conceived by any nation, one that would be able to face the intimidating naval power of its adversaries. The Yamato-class battleship Musashi was secretly built in the Nagasaki shipyard just in time for the Pacific War. Musashi was deemed unsinkable and unmatched by her rivals, and was conceived to take down American battleships, if only she could find them. During her 2-year run, the battleship sailed the northern and central Pacific seas, always ready to engage the enemy, and was present in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. However, the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944 finally gave her an opportunity to prove herself, but the Japanese made a crucial mistake. It was one of many that even included flooding the town that gave birth to her. Following the catastrophic events of World War I, the world leaders wanted to prevent another war at all costs. One measure to achieve this came in the form of the Washington Naval Treaty, an agreement between the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Japan to limit the size and number of warships they could build. The agreement was ratified in 1923 and soon after recognized by the League of Nations. However, Japan was not happy with it. Japan had taken an isolationist approach until the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854 and was still recovering from the trauma that this agreement caused the nation. At the time, U.S. President Millard Fillmore ordered Commodore Matthew C. Perry to pressure the Japanese. With 9 ships and 3 steam frigates, the Commodore couldn't level Tokyo, but the Japanese never forgot. Consequently, the Japanese naval doctrine now stated that they needed a fleet that amounted to 70% of the Americans' capacity. However, the Washington Naval Treaty only allowed them to possess 60 ships for every 100 American vessels. The proud Japanese people were not happy with a measure that rendered them defenseless and thus rejected the agreement, resolving to defy it. However, they did not receive significant pushback. Under the administration of President Woodrow Wilson, the U.S. was expanding its navy while adhering to the limitations stipulated in the agreement. And while the nation was not yet at the peak of its development in the early 20th century, the Japanese produced merely 18% of the superpower's gross domestic product. An open arms race against the mighty Americans would certainly cripple their economy. The Japanese concluded that only a powerful fleet could protect them, but they currently had roughly 55% of the equivalent American capital ships. At the mercy of American gunboat policy, or even the threat of becoming another European colony, they came up with a straightforward solution: to build a battleship able to intimidate even the Americans. The Yamato-class battleships would need to be superior to their U.S. counterparts, with unmatched magnitude and weaponry. If they couldn't overpower their adversaries in number, they would do so in size. A design competition was announced in March of 1937. The requirements included a colossal vessel that could carry at least 8 18.1-inch guns and withstand a hit from these same guns. Captain Kikuo Fujimoto's Plan Number A-140F6 eventually emerged victorious. Fujimoto's vision was a gigantic floating fortress that could travel at 27 knots with a range of 7,200 nautical miles while displacing almost 72,000 long tons at deep load. In addition, flood control compartments would keep it seaworthy. The ship was 862 feet 10 inches long, with a 127-foot 7-inch beam and a 30-foot 1-inch draft. The beam was wider in the center, leaving the bow and stern unarmored. Still, the hull featured the heaviest armor ever used on a ship. The behemoth was more heavily armored than any British or American ship, with 3 triple-gun turrets of 45 caliber 46cm Type 94 guns, the largest naval guns in the world. A secondary battery consisted of 12 60 caliber 15.5cm third-year type guns mounted on 4 triple turrets. A dozen 40 caliber 5-inch Type 89 dual-purpose guns and 6 twin turrets provided stout anti-aircraft defense. And the ship also carried 36 1-inch Type 96 light anti-aircraft guns in 12 triple-gun mounts, and 2 twin mounts for .52-inch Type 93 machine guns. Shipwreck hunter David Mearns would say, quote, "She's not just 10% bigger than some of these other vessels, she's nearly double." The Yamato-class battleships would become the heaviest and most powerful ships of their kind ever built. Yamato and her younger sister Musashi had to be kept secret. The battleships were thus built in different stages at different locations. Before even starting to build Musashi, the construction spillway had to be reinforced and the workshops enlarged. To carry her weight, specialized cranes also had to be built. Then, on March 29, 1938, Musashi's keel was laid at the Mitsubishi shipyard in Nagasaki. However, there was a significant issue. The USS Consular Office stood right across the bay, and to convey the construction site, a huge curtain had to be woven with hemp rope. The country's entire rope stock was used. In late May, a squadron of Chinese-marked bombers piloted by Russians overflew the city while dropping propaganda leaflets, but it was evident that there was more to their venture. However, when the spies shared their images with the Americans, they were not interested in taking part, as there was no war yet. 2.5 years later, on November 1st, 1940, Musashi was launched. To keep the event a secret, officials used the excuse of an air raid drill and sent all residents home. Roughly 2,000 elements of the local police, the military police, and the Sasebo Sailor Corps patrolled the streets, ensuring that no one left their properties. Meanwhile, a huge freighter was stationed at the bay to conceal the launching site from the coast. At 8:55 a.m., the nobles and high-ranking officials attending the occasion finished their prayers, and the immense battleship was launched into the bay's shallow waters. However, the maneuver was not as silent and discreet as the engineers had hoped. When Musashi broke the surface, it displaced a considerable amount of water, creating a 4-foot-high tsunami. The harbor was battered, and the narrow rivers were forced to flow upstream, capsizing several fishing boats. The water then gushed up to street level and poured into several houses and shops. The locals were scared and stormed out of their homes in panic, but the officers quickly forced them back inside. The town eventually went back to normal, and after the unforeseen setback, Musashi sailed to Sasebo to be fitted out. The Japanese engineers and Navy officers were convinced that such a gigantic vessel ought to be unsinkable. As former crew member Masahiro Ohishi recalled, quote, "We never thought for a second that Musashi would sink. We believed that such a giant ship could not be taken down." Musashi was even compared to the popular character of King Kong. The ship was likened to the beloved figure to win public support, as the Hollywood film was a hit with Japanese audiences. What's more, the movie was believed to convey a deeper meaning that aligned with the Japanese state of mind. In the words of historian and author Martin K.A. Morgan, quote, "It is not just a comparison evocative of power and strength. It's also kind of pointed squarely at New York City, and therefore pointed directly at the Americans." The unparalleled battleship was now ready to serve its grandiose purpose. Musashi was commissioned on August 5, 1942, and assigned to the 1st Battleship Division with her sister Yamato. Later on, she was modified to serve as the flagship for the combined fleet. After spending the rest of 1942 working up, the battleship was transferred to Truk in early 1943. That year, Musashi embarked on several sorties with her fleet, searching for American forces in the area to no avail. Then, in early 1944, an American submarine torpedoed the behemoth, and she was forced to return to Japan. During the repairs, the Navy upgraded her anti-aircraft armament. Her 15.5-centimeter wing turrets were replaced with 3 triple 25mm gun mounts each. In addition, 16 triple 25mm mounts and 25 single mounts were added. The ship's light anti-aircraft armament now consisted of 115 guns. Throughout the year, Musashi served as a transport, transferring forces and equipment between Japan and its occupied territories. And while she was present at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, she never came into contact with American surface forces. By mid-October, Musashi traveled to Brunei Bay in Borneo, ready to join the main Japanese fleet. The Americans had landed in Leyte, and the Imperial Navy prepared a counterattack known as Operation Show 1. They then sailed for the Philippines on the 22nd. 2 days later, Musashi would engage in her first real combat experience. While transiting the Sibuyan Sea, a U.S. reconnaissance aircraft spotted the Japanese fleet. The battleship was engulfed by a flock of Curtiss Helldivers and Grumman Avengers 2 hours later. A bomb then struck turret number 1, but caused no harm. But 2 minutes later, a torpedo struck her starboard. Musashi swallowed 3,000 long tons of water and listed over 5 degrees. However, her counter-flooding compartments compensated for the damage and reduced the listing to only 1 degree. It wasn't long before another squadron of Helldivers charged against the vessel. A rain of bombs poured on the battleship, which was now severely damaged and lowered her speed. A relentless spread of torpedoes soon followed, and another group of 29 Hellcats soon arrived to drop their payloads. A final round of torpedoes then settled Musashi's fate, whose bow was now down 13 feet. After several more airstrikes from an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs, the the Japanese fleet abandoned Musashi to fend for herself and returned roughly an hour later to watch her go down. Her list eventually reached 30 degrees, and she then capsized and sank in one piece, taking less than half of her crew with her. When her wreck was found in 2015 by an expert team sponsored by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, it was concluded that the battleship had never been as impenetrable as the Japanese believed, a crucial mistake that cost them too much. Ironically, the most impressive battleship in human history was too late for the battleship era. As she went down, she took with her the age of sea warfare and gave way to modern aerial combat, which she was never built to withstand. Still, Musashi remains a proud achievement for the Japanese. As Robert Kraft, director of subsea operations of the rescue team, expressed, quote, "Musashi was the pride of the Japanese fleet. It was so important to the Japanese people that they didn't even inform the population that it had sunk." Scharnhorst was Germany's first attempt at building warships that could rival the naval supremacy of British and French battlecruisers. Still, it was built under the restrictions of the Washington Naval Treaty that limited the size, weight, and armament of ships, and it was significantly underarmed for its magnitude. Equipped with an 11-inch gun and a dozen 5.9-inch guns, Scharnhorst was laid down in June 1935 and completed in October 1939. Scharnhorst usually sailed in tandem with its sister ship, Gneisenau, and raided parties along with pocket battleships to ravage the routes used by Allied convoys to supply the Soviet Union. After successfully sinking several British merchant ships in the Atlantic and Northern Europe, the Royal Navy began hunting down both German vessels. But Scharnhorst would not go down without a fight. The Battle of the North Cape in December of 1943 would become the last confrontation between British and German big gun capital ships and the penultimate engagement between battleships in the war. And it would take more than 14 heavily armed warships to sink Scharnhorst. When World War I ended, the Treaty of Versailles drastically limited the post-war development of the German military, and their 100,000-man army was not enough to defend the country. The treaty greatly affected the German naval branch, the Kriegsmarine. The Allied powers forbade the Germans from owning or developing dreadnoughts, known as the largest ships of World War I. The military could only keep and upgrade pre-dreadnought class warships with a maximum weight of 10,000 tons, the equivalent of a British heavy cruiser. This meant that Germany was practically defenseless in the case of an attack from its victorious neighbors. Still, German engineers and naval officials did all they could to make the new Kriegsmarine a formidable force and came up with an innovative solution, the so-called pocket battleships. These smaller-sized battleships had an average weight of 12,000 tons and were armed with two triple 11-inch turrets. These ships were not intended as frontline units, but rather as merchant ship raiders. Still, they could outfight and outrun enemy heavy cruisers. The downside was that both the British and the French had fast enough battleships that could rival the German pocket battleship's speed and destroy them. Consequently, the Kriegsmarine decided that building more of these ships would serve no purpose against the superior enemy fleets. A more powerful and heavier battleship class was desperately needed. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, the German rearmament was already underway in a somewhat discreet manner. During this time, the Führer approved more demands from the military and granted contracts and benefits to all the branches of the industry. Hitler was committed to rebuilding the German military from the ground up to restore it to its former glory. It was all part of his plan to make Germany a global superpower once again. The embittered German people stood by the Führer, which led to the government of the Third Reich to negotiate the Anglo-German Naval Agreement to allow the construction of heavier vessels. The permission was granted as most global powers, including Japan, had already begun building more powerful vessels. In 1935, the first two ships of a reinvigorated Kriegsmarine were laid down, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Both were named after two armored cruisers that were destroyed by the Royal Navy in the Battle of Falkland Islands near Argentina during the first days of World War I. The two ships also honored the names of two Prussian generals that were considered the founders of the Prussian army during the Napoleonic Wars of the 19th century. Scharnhorst was laid down in June of 1935 and launched in October of 1936 at the Kriegsmarine Werft dockyard in Wilhelmshaven. It was then completed in January of 1939, months before the Reich decided to invade Poland. The capital ship displaced 32,100 tons while empty and 38,000 tons when fully loaded. It was 235 meters long with a beam of 30 meters, and its maximum draft was almost 10 meters. In addition, the ship was powered by 3 Braun Bavarian Sea geared steam turbines, which delivered over 158,000 horsepower. Its maximum speed was 58 kilometers per hour, and it could cruise for up to 16,000 kilometers without refueling. Scharnhorst's main armament consisted of 9 11-inch guns divided into 3 triple-gun turrets. Anton and Bruno were the forward turrets, and Caesar was located aft. The main battery was lighter than the standard 14 and 15-inch guns carried by battleships, as the engineering team sacrificed firepower for speed and additional armor. Hitler himself decided that the 11-inch guns were a good option, as he did not wish to attract the attention of his European peers. The Führer promised the Kriegsmarine that the ship would be later upgraded with 15-inch guns, but this would never happen. Secondary armament consisted of 12 5.9-inch guns. To deal with aircraft, 14 Flak 38 and 16 SK-C-30AA guns were installed. Scharnhorst had an armor belt that was 350 millimeters thick. The armored deck was initially 40 millimeters thick, and increased up to 105 millimeters near the sides that connected to the bottom of the deck. The 11-inch turrets had 360 millimeters of armor on the front and 200 millimeters on the sides. The ship's crew was manned by almost 2,000 sailors, of which 60 were officers. And after some minor modifications, Scharnhorst was ready for combat in November of 1939. Scharnhorst's first combat mission was on November 21, 1939. Accompanied by its sister ship Gneisenau, 9 destroyers, and the light cruiser Köln, Scharnhorst was tasked with drawing out British vessels that were after the pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee. During the operation, Scharnhorst sank the British merchant cruiser Rawalpindi. Months later, during the German landings in Norway in January of 1940, the British battlecruiser Renown had a close call with Scharnhorst and ran away. But the British aircraft carrier Glorious was not so lucky and was sunk in June while the Heer was still in Norway. During the first months of 1941, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau went on a successful raiding frenzy before returning to the captured French naval base at Brest. And by May, the duo was to depart from France to lure the Royal Navy and let the newly commissioned Bismarck battleship make its way through the Denmark Strait to wreak havoc. However, Royal Air Force attacks grounded the operation and doomed the colossal Bismarck. Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and several other ships managed to escape and reach Germany the following days. After that, Scharnhorst remained at Kiel for the entirety of 1942. By 1943, the ship returned to Norway to attack convoys destined for the Soviet Union. In coordination with U-boats, the damage done to supplies bound for Russia was decisive. On Christmas Eve, Scharnhorst left Norway to hunt down a British convoy. The Royal Navy was notified of the German intentions and dispatched a task force to stop the hunter. The British force was divided in 2. One unit was composed of the cruisers Norfolk, Belfast, and Sheffield under the command of Admiral Robert Burnett, while the other was made up of 4 destroyers, the battleship Duke of York and cruiser Jamaica, led by Admiral Bruce Fraser. When Scharnhorst was approaching Bear Island on December 26 to strike the convoy, the British task force was already there to ambush it. German Admiral Erich Bay immediately ordered the crew to battle stations. Belfast scored the first hit on the German ship, destroying its radar antenna. Norfolk then fired, but failed to do much damage. Scharnhorst returned to fire with a salvo from turret Caesar and rapidly turned south at maximum speed. 20 minutes later, Belfast and Norfolk approached the German vessel and began firing again. Scharnhorst retaliated and fired from its aft turret, scoring twice on Norfolk and destroying its gunnery radar while disabling its turret. Bay then ordered to turn at full speed to escape the enemy, but the Duke of York was already on its tail and opened fire at 11,000 meters. One 14-inch shell hit one of Scharnhorst's turrets, jamming the training gears and disabling it. Another shell ignited the ammunition magazines and forced the German crew to flood the forward weaponry to prevent an explosion. With one turret out of action, the situation was turning grimmer for the Kriegsmarine sailors. But the men refused to go down without a fight and kept firing at Duke of York. Still, another pair of 14-inch shells suddenly hit turrets Bruno and Caesar, rendering them ineffective. German casualties began to mount up, and more shells from the more powerful Duke of York destroyed the secondary armament of the lone German vessel. As the firefight turned more personal and violent, Scharnhorst attempted to take down its British counterpart, but its 11-inch shells were not enough to put it out of action. After hours of combat, another shell from Duke of York passed through the German ship's upper belt armor and exploded in the boiler room, slowing it down for good. Temporary repairs allowed Scharnhorst to add more distance between Duke of York, and the German crew managed to disable its fire control radar. Still, the fight was not over. After firing 52 salvos, Duke gave way for the destroyers Scorpion and Stord to launch 8 torpedoes, of which 4 hit their target. One torpedo jammed the Bruno turret for good, another damaged the port propeller shaft, the third hit the bow, and the fourth caused minor flooding. While the Caesar turret was focused on Duke of York, Jamaica and Belfast closed in and launched more torpedoes. After almost an entire day of combat, Scharnhorst began to steadily go down and ultimately went down by the bow. Scattered fire from the secondary guns was interpreted as an act of bravery and defiance from the British sailors, but they quickly went silent in the middle of the darkness. The British vessels then turned their searchlights on to find survivors, and merely 36 men were rescued from a crew of 2,000. Distressing sounds were still coming from the water, but the British ships were ordered to pull out and regroup. The sinking of Scharnhorst would give the Royal Navy room to breathe and continue safely with their convoy routes to Russia, while several of their big ships could now be used for other missions. As for the Germans, their surface navy would never recover. In the chilling waters of the North Pacific, a high-stakes game of World War II naval warfare was about to unfold. By March 1943, America was gearing up to reclaim the Alaskan islands of Attu and Kiska, snatched by the Japanese the previous year. The U.S. Navy's mission: intercept and destroy Japanese resupply convoys. But on March 26th, Rear Admiral Charles H. McMorris, at the helm of a small task group, stumbled upon more than anyone had anticipated. A formidable Japanese group, escorted by 8 warships, including 2 heavy and 2 light cruisers, was advancing. The Americans, led by the heavy cruiser Salt Lake City and the light cruiser Richmond, were clearly outmatched. Yet they bravely engaged. Salt Lake City, despite drawing first blood against the Japanese cruiser Nachi, was battered and on the brink of destruction. As the smoke of battle thickened, the Japanese, for reasons still debated, made a move that nobody expected. In June 1942, the Japanese forces landed on the western Aleutian islands of Kiska and Attu as part of their plan to attack Midway Island. However, they suffered a significant defeat at Midway and decided to hold on to these crucial islands as a defensive shield against potential American counterattacks toward the Kuriles. As the United States prepared to assault the Japanese strongholds, they sought to disrupt Japanese shipping between Japan and the islands. American submarines and aircraft started harassing Japanese convoys. To counter this threat, the Japanese Imperial Navy began sailing at night or taking advantage of stormy weather to protect their supply routes. Aware of the Japanese tactics, Admiral Thomas Kinkaid deployed a surface force around Attu to further obstruct their shipping. On the night of February 19, 1943, the patrol force, comprising the heavy cruiser Indianapolis and the destroyers Coughlin and Gillespie, successfully shelled and sunk the Japanese transport ship Akiganimaru west of Attu. In response to the American blockade, Vice Admiral Bashiro Hosagaya, who was in charge of the Fifth Fleet and the Northern Theater of Operations, gathered a high-speed convoy with 2 fast merchant ships, the Sakamoru and Sakito Maru, and a slower transport ship called Sanko Maru. They carried crucial materials needed to complete the construction of an all-weather airstrip on Attu. But then, the Americans intercepted a secret message from the Japanese. The message revealed that Japan was sending much-needed supplies to its forces in the Aleutian Islands, so they quickly devised a plan to intercept and stop the Japanese convoy. Rear Admiral Charles McMorris was in charge of the mission. He had 1 heavy cruiser, 1 light cruiser, and 4 destroyers at his disposal. It sounded like a simple task, but things soon got tricky. Admiral McMorris led a task group in the North Pacific on a mission to intercept Japanese reinforcements. The group consisted of the light cruiser Richmond, under Captain Theodore Waldschmidt, and the destroyers Bailey, Coughlin, Dale, and Monahan, commanded by Captain Ralph Riggs. Recently, the heavy cruiser Salt Lake City, captained by Bertram Rogers, had joined the group after undergoing repairs. On March 26th, just before sunrise, the task group was 180 miles west of Attu and 100 miles south of the nearest Komandorski Island. The ships were spread out in a scouting line, carefully zigzagging at 15 knots. The weather was freezing, but the sea was relatively calm, providing excellent visibility. During breakfast, the van destroyer Coughlin and flagship Richmond simultaneously detected radar contacts of 5 vessels about 7.5 to 12 miles north of their position. Admiral McMorris ordered his ships to focus on Richmond. As the day broke, more vessels were spotted, possibly transports or cargo carriers with destroyer and light cruiser escorts. McMorris was not overly concerned, despite the increasing number of enemy ships, thinking it might be a straightforward victory, a Roman holiday. The crews prepared for battle, readying their guns. In the words of naval analyst Samuel Eliot Morrison, quote, "Prisoners were released from the brig, messmen sliced bread for sandwiches, cooks put coffee on to boil, and all preparations were made for a morning's battle." Little did they know that the battle about to unfold would put Salt Lake City, the newest addition to the group, to the test. The Japanese cruiser squadron sailed in the vast Pacific Ocean. They didn't have a radar like the American force, but they did have a unique advantage. Their keen-eyed lookouts, hand-picked by the Japanese Navy with their exceptional vision, spotted the American fleet half an hour before the Americans noticed them. The southern horizon was getting brighter earlier than the northern horizon, which also helped the Japanese to spot their rivals. This encounter would be quite extraordinary. Far away from any help, neither fleet had aircraft or submarines to assist them in battle. It meant that this fight would be solely between their surface ships. It was a rare occasion in the Pacific theater, and one of the last times that powerful fleets engaged in a pure gunnery duel in naval history. Thus, when the Americans intercepted the Japanese some 100 nautical miles south of the Komandorski Islands and 180 nautical miles west of Attu at around 8 a.m., Admiral McMorris found himself in a challenging situation. Unexpectedly, he came upon Admiral Hosogaya's entire fleet, escorting a group of reinforcements to Attu. The enemy fleet consisted of heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers, outnumbering McMorris's American forces by more than 2 to 1. Realizing the tough odds, McMorris had to make a decision quickly. He opted for a bold move, trying to catch and sink the Japanese transports while his own fleet engaged in long-range gunfire. He knew it was a risky plan, but he wanted to give his men a fighting chance. McMorris urgently sent out a plea for air support to the USAAF airbase at Adak. The situation had escalated beyond their control, and they needed reinforcements to tip the scales in their favor. The call for assistance reached the seasoned B-24 squadron, who immediately embarked on a journey across the fog-laden skies. Regrettably, the fog became an insurmountable obstacle. Despite their best efforts, they found themselves lost, so the commander made the difficult decision to turn the squadron around and return home. The naval force would be fighting on their own. As the engagement began, McMorris had to carefully coordinate with Captain Rogers of the heavy cruiser Salt Lake City, or Swayback Maru, as the crew called the 13-year-old heavy cruiser due to her pronounced sheer. He had no choice. His flagship, Richmond, would follow the movements of the more powerful cruiser. While no spotting planes were launched by the Americans to conserve resources, the Japanese launched a spotting plane, but it proved ineffective due to poor communications and strong anti-aircraft fire from the American ships. They were caught off guard when the Japanese unexpectedly opened fire at a distance of 20,000 yards. The enemy focused their attacks on Swayback Maru, to which the ship retaliated with successful hits on the enemy cruiser Nachi. However, the American attempts to reach the enemy transports were thwarted as the Japanese changed course and closed the range, prompting Captain McMorris to turn away temporarily. The battle continued with intense exchanges of fire between Salt Lake City and the Japanese cruiser Maya. Both ships maneuvered skillfully, engaging in a 3.5-hour-long duel. Despite Salt Lake City suffering some damage, Captain Rogers remained composed and confident of victory. The American destroyers refrained from long-range firing, while the enemy destroyers and light cruiser Abokuma cautiously planned a torpedo attack. The enemy cruiser Tama attempted to hinder the American advance, but eventually retreated. The battle intensified, and at one point, Maya successfully hit Salt Lake City amidships, causing casualties and a fire. The Japanese cruiser Nachi was struck and slowed down by a devastating shot from an American destroyer. Both sides momentarily stopped firing, and Captain McMorris believed they had disabled the enemy cruiser. He decided to change course to target the enemy transports. However, Nachi and Maya, accompanied by 4 destroyers, resumed pursuit, engaging in a zigzagging chase. As the battle raged on, both sides fought fiercely. Despite being faster, Nachi and Maya struggled to maintain their pace while zigzagging. Then, Hosogaya focused on attacking Salt Lake City with minimal risk to his own ships. Captain Rogers found the light cruiser Tama in a favorable position to spot for Nachi and Maya, 2 enemy cruisers, so he sought permission from the Admiral to attack her. Salt Lake City fired multiple salvos, forcing Tama to take evasive action. Meanwhile, they received a dispatch from Admiral Thomas Casson Kincaid suggesting a possible retreat, but they decided to press on. Unfortunately, Salt Lake's steering gear started malfunctioning shortly past 10 a.m. due to previous trouble, but the crew managed to improvise a solution. Despite the challenges, Salt Lake continued to fire at the enemy. Maya and Nachi closed in, causing concern for her crew. The situation became critical as their plan to attack the enemy's transports fell apart, and the main focus became saving their own ships. Captain Rogers requested a smokescreen to provide cover, which the Admiral approved. The American ships laid effective smoke cover and changed course to 240 degrees to take advantage of it. Reportedly, the incredible accuracy demonstrated by the Japanese gunners and how they shifted their fire misled the Americans into believing that at least one of the Japanese cruisers had fire control radar. As time passed, the American fleet was heading westward at high speed, with the enemy in pursuit. They were over 500 miles from a dock and much closer to the Japanese base at Paramashiro. With the enemy gaining speed, Admiral McMorris decided to make a daring turn to the south in an attempt to break away. Maya and Nachi seemed confused by the smokescreen, allowing the American fleet to gain distance. The enemy fired torpedoes, but they didn't hit their target. As the situation remained tense, the American fleet continued its escape to the south. Salt Lake faced immense challenges. The ship had already taken 3 hits and was struck once more, causing flooding in critical areas. Despite the dire situation, the crew displayed remarkable bravery and determination. Damage control men worked tirelessly, using their own shirts to plug leaks in the ship's outer skin while standing in oil sludge and icy water. Although the flooding caused a significant list to the port side, Salt Lake continued to fight and maintain full speed. However, the after fire room was damaged, and the ship's speed dropped to 20 knots. Captain McMorris ordered a torpedo attack by 3 destroyers, but it was later cancelled as Salt Lake's speed picked up. But the ship's situation worsened when Arctic seawater mixed with the fuel oil, causing the burners to go out, steam pressure to drop, and the main engines to stop. Salt Lake was left adrift and defenseless. Enemy ships Maya and Nachi were closing in rapidly, and Japanese destroyers were also approaching to launch torpedo attacks. However, fate took a sudden turn. Captain Rogers, in a desperate move, requested a torpedo attack, and it was authorized. Meanwhile, the enemy column inexplicably changed course to the west, breaking off the engagement. Several reasons led to the decision by the Japanese commander to withdraw, including low fuel supply, insufficient ammunition, and disappointment with his destroyer's performance. Amidst the chaos, American bombers were expected, and the confusion caused by Salt Lake's different shell plumes, mistaken for aerial bombs, added to the Japanese commander's uncertainty. Besides, towards the end of the battle, a valiant United States destroyer managed to hit the Japanese flagship, Nachi. In a stroke of luck, and with the courage of her crew, Salt Lake was saved from what seemed like certain doom, and the enemy withdrew, ending the intense and dramatic naval confrontation. Bailey, along with Coughlin and Monahan, took on Nachi and Maya. Despite being bombarded heavily by the enemy, the American destroyers pressed on, with Lieutenant Commander Atkinson skillfully dodging incoming salvos. Suddenly, an 8-inch shell struck Bailey's galley door, but Captain Riggs made a quick decision to launch torpedoes from a safe distance of 10,000 yards. Bailey faced another hit, losing all electric power, and the sister destroyers decided to retreat without launching their torpedoes. Salt Lake City also suffered damage, but managed to recover quickly. In just 4 minutes, the crew repaired the ship's engines and got her back up to speed. The battle eventually ended, and the Japanese ships disappeared from sight. Despite the challenges, Salt Lake City and her sister ships proved their mettle and survived the encounter with remarkably low casualties. They headed towards Dutch Harbor under Admiral McMorris's command. Although no ships were sunk on either side and the casualties were less than 60, the impact of the battle was much greater than it seemed. The Japanese convoy was forced to retreat, and they could no longer use the northern supply route to reach the Aleutian Islands. From then on, the Japanese forces in the Aleutians had to rely only on submarines for supplies. Unfortunately for them, submarines couldn't provide enough material for their needs, giving the American forces a significant advantage in the region. Even though not many people remember the Battle of the Komandorski Islands today, it played a crucial role in America's victory in the Aleutian Islands. It showed that even in a seemingly minor clash, the strategic outcome could be immense. And so, this forgotten naval battle became a tale of triumph for the U.S. Navy. As nightfall plunged the tumultuous waters of the Pacific into darkness, American battleship USS Washington raced toward Guadalcanal. With bated breath, her hardy crew readied themselves for battle, anticipating the violent clash that lay before them. A Japanese bombardment group was rapidly moving in on the war-torn tropical island, hell-bent on destroying Allied positions there to clear the way for a full-blown invasion. Navigating the infamous stretch of sea known as Iron Bottom Sound, alongside her fellow battleship USS South Dakota and 4 destroyers, an ominous blip on Washington's search radar let Rear Admiral Willis Ching Lee know they had located the enemy fleet. Under his command, Task Force 64 began the attack. Washington let rip a devastating assault with the 9 thunderous Mach 6 guns that made up her main battery, while her secondary guns launched star shells to illuminate the Japanese positions. A ferocious firefight ensued. South Dakota took heavy fire, and in this chaos, a sudden barrage of torpedoes sliced through the water, heading straight for USS Washington. Having not built any new battleships since the Colorado-class in the early 1920s, by the mid-1930s, the General Board of the U.S. Navy was keen to launch a bigger vessel with greater firepower. The USS Washington belonged to this new class of battleship, named North Carolina, after the first and only other example of this type. With an overall length of 728 feet 9 inches and a standard displacement of 35,000 long tons, increasing to 44,800 long tons at full combat load, Washington was certainly an imposing force on the water, carrying 1,800 officers and enlisted men during peacetime, though this would eventually grow to 99 officers and 2,035 enlisted men during the war. For 4 General Electric steam turbines, used steam from 8 Babcock & Wilcox boilers to power the propeller shafts, giving a shaft horsepower of 121,000 and a top speed of 28 knots, equivalent to 32 miles per hour. The initial design of the North Carolina-class battleships featured 14-inch guns in the main battery, respecting the restriction imposed by the Second London Naval Treaty of 1936. However, when Japan withdrew from the treaty on March 27, 1937, the U.S. invoked the escalator clause and increased the size of the guns to 16 inches. General Board member Admiral Joseph Reeves made the case for larger guns by explaining how, during the Battle of Jutland in World War I, they had been shown to have significantly greater armor penetration, and suggested that they would be advantageous when using the newly developed indirect method of shooting, in which warships would receive information about enemy positions from aircraft, allowing them to fire at targets beyond the horizon. Initially reluctant, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's government made one last attempt to convince the Japanese to accept the 14-inch limit, but they said they would only do so if the US and UK agreed to reduce their number of battleships to bring them in line with Japan. Unwilling to make such a sacrifice, on July 10, 1937, the President cleared the use of the larger weapons. No longer restricted, the ship's main battery was given 9 16-inch 45 caliber Mark VI guns, capable of ripping through most enemy warships' armor. These were arranged in 3 triple-gun turrets on the center line. The secondary battery was made up of 20 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns mounted in twin turrets clustered amidships, with 5 turrets on either side. Originally, Washington was also armed with an anti-aircraft battery of 16 1.1-inch guns and 18 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, though this was later expanded. Unfortunately, Washington's 12-inch thick armored belt, 5.5-inch thick main armored deck, and 16-inch thick main battery gun turret faces had been designed to protect her from opponents with weapons of up to 14 inches. By the time it became clear that the Japanese would not accept the limitation, meaning that Washington may have to face larger guns, it was already too late to upgrade her armor. Still, as Washington's keel was laid down on June 14, 1938, at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, despite increasing German and Japanese expansionism ringing alarm bells among the international community, the United States was still committed to a policy of non-intervention, and it was unclear whether their latest battleship would ever even see a combat situation. USS Washington's hull was launched on June 1, 1940, and after fitting out work, she was officially commissioned on May 15, 1941. Testing would soon reveal some problems with vibration, but attempts to make modifications had to be put on hold when the vicious surprise attacks on Pearl Harbor forced the United States to abandon neutrality and join World War II. As the flagship of Rear Admiral John W. Wilcox Jr.'s Task Force 39, Washington set sail for the British naval base at Scapa Flow in northern Scotland on March 26, 1942. However, just one day into her journey, her wartime career got off to a tragic start when Rear Admiral Wilcox was swept overboard, drowning in the choppy Atlantic waters. In spite of this unfortunate incident, Washington and Task Force 39 had to press on, and soon united with the Royal Navy Home Fleet at Scapa Flow to prepare for joint operations. With Task Force 39 now redesignated Task Force 99, Washington led the ships on their first mission on April 28th, working alongside British vessels to clear the path for a supply convoy to their Soviet allies by conducting a sweep of German warships. However, things would soon take a turn for the worse when Royal Navy battleship HMS King George V, accompanying Task Force 99, accidentally rammed the destroyer Punjabi, also part of the mission, cutting her in two. Punjabi quickly started to sink. Washington, following closely behind, began evasive maneuvers. As she neared the sinking wreck of the Punjabi, the destroyer's depth charges exploded. Luckily for Washington, the explosion was just far enough for her to escape nearly unscathed. Upon inspection, there was only a little damage to her radars and fire control equipment, and a small fuel tank leak, which were quickly addressed. On July 1st, while escorting convoy PQ-17, Washington would once again find herself in another brush with danger. After a reconnaissance error led to false reports of German warships approaching for attack, the Allied vessels were ordered to scatter, leaving them exposed to roaming U-boats and Luftwaffe, between them sinking 24 of the 35 transport ships. After such a pronounced run of bad luck, it was time for Washington to leave Europe and head back to the United States for a refit. With renovations complete, it was now time for USS Washington to test her mettle against a different enemy on the other side of the world. Leaving Brooklyn Naval Yard on August 23, 1942, with an escort of 3 destroyers, Washington crossed the Panama Canal on her way to Tonga, where she arrived on September 14th to become the flagship of Rear Admiral Willis Ching Lee. Before long, she was assigned to protect convoys, shipping vital supplies and reinforcements to Marines fighting in the strategically crucial Solomon Islands. However, a series of fierce naval battles throughout the fall would leave the U.S. fleet seriously depleted, with many ships lost or heavily damaged. On September 15th, while escorting transports to Guadalcanal, USS Wasp was struck by torpedoes from a Japanese submarine, leading to catastrophic explosions and a rapid sinking. Later, on October 26th, in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, USS Hornet sustained severe damage from dive bombers and torpedoes, ultimately requiring scuttling after repair efforts failed. With Wasp and Hornet sunk, Washington now found itself one of only 3 Allied capital ships remaining in the region, along with the carrier Enterprise and the new battleship South Dakota. With few options available to him, when South Pacific Area Commander Admiral William Bull Halsey got word of an impending large-scale Japanese attack, he grouped Washington, South Dakota, and 4 of the destroyers under Rear Admiral Lee's command as Task Force 16-3. The battleships, with minimal direct combat experience and having operated together for just a few days, were paired with 4 destroyer escorts from different divisions. Despite these challenges, this combined force was the only hope to stop an enemy fleet intent on bombarding key Allied positions on Guadalcanal, where a grueling land battle was underway. The Japanese bombardment group, led by Admiral Nobutake Kondo, approached Guadalcanal via Indispensable Strait in the early hours of November 14th. Consisting of the fast battleship Kirishima, the heavy cruisers Takao and Atago, light cruisers Nagara and Sendai, as well as 9 destroyers, it vastly outnumbered Lee's task force, now redesignated Task Force 64. The American ships arrived in the stretch of sea to the north of Guadalcanal, known as Iron Bottom Sound, that evening. At 10:55 p.m., the radar systems aboard Washington and South Dakota began emitting blips. It could mean only one thing: the enemy was in the area. Lee gave the order to prepare for battle, with the 4 destroyers heading to the front and the battleships bringing up the rear. Identifying a Japanese cruiser and destroyer near Savo Island, he gave the word for both battleships to open fire. At 11:17 p.m., Washington started firing star shells from her secondary guns to light up the enemy targets before attacking with her main battery, with South Dakota joining the onslaught moments later. Despite the intense barrage of the American battleships, the Japanese ships were able to escape from the danger zone unscathed. Realizing his targets had gotten away, Lee ordered a ceasefire 5 minutes later. At the same time, the battleship's destroyer escort had run into 2 different groups of Japanese ships who launched a savage torrent of gunfire and torpedoes. After 8 minutes of chaos, USS Walkie had fallen victim to a powerful cruiser salvo, while USS Preston met the same fate moments later, both ships now steadily sinking into the depths below. Meanwhile, USS Benham had part of her bow blown off by a torpedo, forcing her to retreat before sinking the following day. It wouldn't be long before the 4th and final destroyer, USS Gwynn, took a direct hit on her engine room, leaving her no choice but to abandon the fight. With the destroyers eliminated, Washington and South Dakota were now left on their own to face the strength of Kondo's warships. Arriving on the scene of the carnage still littered with the wreckage of her former escorts, Washington spotted the Japanese destroyer Ayanami and opened fire with her secondary batteries, setting the enemy vessel ablaze. However, this moment of triumph would prove to be short-lived, as South Dakota, which had been following closely behind Washington, suddenly experienced electrical failures, knocking her radar, radios, and the majority of her gun batteries out of action. As the 2 battleships had to cautiously maneuver their way through the marine battlefield in order to avoid the sinking destroyers, a series of abrupt turns soon found them separated from one another. South Dakota was now extremely vulnerable. She was isolated, effectively blind, and unable to use her guns. To make matters worse, having changed course to avoid hitting the crippled Benham, Her silhouette was brightly drawn by the flames from the burning destroyers, making her a sitting duck for the approaching Japanese Navy. Sure enough, by the time the clock struck midnight, most of Kondo's force had now united, and seeing the severely disadvantaged battleship ahead, joined together in a relentless assault. Although she had been able to use her few functioning guns to land a few hits on Kirishima, by the end of the intense encounter, South Dakota had been hit 26 times, setting her upper decks on fire and completely destroying her communication systems, as well as what was left of her gunfire control operations. Admiral Lee later said that the Japanese had managed to, quote, render one of our new battleships deaf, dumb, blind, and impotent. Unable to continue fighting, the battered South Dakota bowed out and began heading for safety. The Allies' sole hope of victory in the battle now rested on the shoulders of USS Washington. Though the odds were stacked against her, she soon saw her chance. As the Japanese focused on their pursuit of South Dakota, determined to finish off the crippled vessel, they failed to notice Washington advancing on rival battleship Kirishima. Sneaking into position, she opened fire, subjecting her unsuspecting victim to a brutal pounding at close range. The damage was serious. Kirishima burst into flames and started rapidly filling with water. All her main gun turrets knocked out, leaving her utterly defenseless in the face of Washington's assault. She was hit below the surface, jamming her rudder and causing her to circle uncontrollably. With Kirishima effectively neutralized, Washington was now free to turn her attention to the heavy cruisers Atago and Takao, and Lee gave the order to open fire. Determined not to suffer the same fate as Kirishima, the pair of Japanese warships pulled back in preparation for torpedo attacks. The two sides were now in the midst of a fierce skirmish, but somehow neither one was able to hit their target. Suddenly, Japanese reinforcements arrived in the form of two destroyers who had been escorting a convoy of transports nearby. Realizing there was no way Washington could come out victorious against the emboldened opposition in a firefight, Lee instead strategically opted to flee the scene. Not only did he want to avoid getting hit, but he also hoped to lure the enemy away from South Dakota, Benham, and Guim, all badly hit, but still afloat in the area. As she turned around to make her escape, flurries of torpedoes came chasing her from behind, yet Washington avoided their wrath as she successfully drew the Japanese fleet away from the damaged American vessels. After an hour of hot pursuit, Kondo eventually gave up, allowing Washington to make her getaway. By the time Japanese destroyers made it back to the gravely wounded Kirishima, they found her engulfed in flames and smoke, still slowly circling as she continued to flood, eventually capsizing and sinking at 3:25 a.m. Meanwhile, Ayanami was abandoned and scuttled before joining Kirishima in her watery grave. Thanks to Washington's impressive display of strategic acumen, tenacity, and courage in the face of danger, the U.S. Navy was successfully able to prevent Kondo's planned bombardment of Guadalcanal. Furthermore, by disrupting the convoy of transports to the island, she destroyed their hopes of disembarking under cover of darkness, resulting in them falling victim to an attack from Allied aircraft, ships, and artillery that morning. Following her stellar performance at Guadalcanal, USS Washington continued to play a supporting role in Allied operations in the Pacific, participating in campaigns in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, the Mariana and Palau Islands, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. She was decommissioned on October 27, 1947, and after most of her armament was taken for use on other battleships during the 1950s, she was sold for scrap on May 24, 1961, and broken up soon afterward. While USS Washington may no longer physically exist, the stories of her heroics at the Battle of Guadalcanal will last for many generations to come. Navy chaplain Joseph Timothy O'Callaghan had been drowsily chewing on his French toast when a thunderous roar reverberated through USS Franklin, shaking her to her core. He and the other officers instinctively dashed towards the main deck. USS Franklin was the first U.S. carrier to get within 50 miles of mainland Japan during World War II, so an attack was not unexpected. Still, what O'Callaghan was about to witness would leave him at a loss for words. Glass shards slammed the young chaplain's face as the light fixtures on the ship's corridors burst into pieces before the continuous detonations. Two 550-pound armor-piercing bombs had shattered through the carrier's decks, causing an uncontrollable inferno and leaving the vessel utterly helpless. Now, dozens of fuel-loaded aircraft and thousands of rockets and ammunition depots were on the brink of exploding. The fire spread across the lower decks, and a single breath of the scorching air could tear a sailor's lungs. Instead of fleeing, O'Callaghan's military and spiritual duties kicked in, and he began tending to the wounded, giving the last rites to his agonized comrades. Outside, U.S. Navy commanders from other U.S. ships witnessed the overwhelming damage and suggested scuttling Franklin at once. They were too close to the enemy to try to save her. However, Captain Leslie E. Garris vehemently refused. There were still close to 1,000 sailors below deck, and he would not abandon them. Come what may, USS Franklin would not sink that day. USS Franklin was the fifth of 24 Essex-class aircraft carriers. These colossal capital ships were designed with a wartime mentality, and they were not limited by the Washington Naval Treaty that had previously crippled the size and firepower of other vessels. She was laid down on December 7, 1942, and commissioned for war in the Pacific in January of 1944. Franklin displaced 36,380 long tons while fully loaded, and could carry between 90 and 100 aircraft. The ship had a length of 872 feet, a beam of 93 feet, and a draft of 34 feet. She was powered by 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers and propelled by 4 shafts and 4 geared turbines that allowed her to reach speeds of up to 38 miles per hour. The ship had a crew of 2,600 men that manned 4 single and 4 twin 127mm dual-purpose guns, 8 quadruple 40mm anti-aircraft guns, and over 40 single 20mm anti-aircraft guns. In June of 1944, she linked up with Task Group 58.2 at a new attack island, where she served as the flagship of Rear Admiral Ralph E. Davison. It was then that her aircrews tasted combat for the first time, during carrier strikes on the Bonin Islands. The aircraft destroyed multiple Japanese installations, such as airfields, barracks, and depots, to successfully ease the capture of the Mariana Islands for friendly ground forces. In July, her aircrews led more airstrikes on Rota Island and Guam to support Allied amphibious operations, as the U.S. Navy had to destroy and secure multiple enemy air bases that controlled the airspace from the Philippines to Okinawa before Luzon's recovery could occur. Franklin's Vought F-4U Corsairs also conducted photographic reconnaissance missions to conduct airstrikes on other islands. The crew operated non-stop, gaining experience with every single mission. And after resupplying at Saipan, USS Franklin was sent to Yap Island to provide air coverage for the upcoming invasion of Peleliu Island. On September 15, 1944, tragedy struck USS Franklin for the first time. After a successful fighter sweep against Cagayan in the Philippines, the ship was attacked by 3 Japanese aircraft, one of which scored a hit that took 3 lives and wounded 20. Still, the crew eagerly moved forward and destroyed more Japanese aircraft during the Formosa air battle in October, just as the invasion of Leyte took form. During the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, which happened from October 23rd to 26th, Franklin's Corsairs fought like madmen against the Japanese First Raiding Force under the command of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. The seasoned pilots of USS Franklin were even more lauded for sinking one of the world's most powerful warships ever built, the Musashi. On October 27th, USS Franklin's task group was operating south of Mindoro Island, trying to destroy a Japanese cruiser and several destroyers. Amidst the fire and smoke that filled the ambiance, the Japanese sent a unit of kamikazes to deal as much damage as possible to the Americans. Despite the accurate fire of the 4 carriers and the more than 20 destroyers and cruisers that protected USS Franklin, 6 enemy bombers managed to break into the formation. 3 were swiftly shot down by Franklin's anti-aircraft guns, while the other 2 went directly to the surrounding carriers. Unfortunately, one of them managed to hit Franklin's flight deck. Although damaged, the surviving crew was able to stop the fires in less than 2 hours to ensure that friendly aircraft could land safely. The carrier then made her way to Leyte Atoll for repairs. By then, Captain J.M. Shoemaker was relieved by World War I veteran Captain Leslie E. Garris, an officer known for his harsh, obstinate, and very strict demeanor. During the event, Garris reprimanded the crew, telling them, quote, "It was your fault because you didn't shoot the kamikaze down. You didn't do your duty. You're incompetent, lazy, and careless. Evidently you don't know your jobs, and I'm going to do my best to shape up this crew." Without realizing it, they were being prepared for an inconceivable test. After a brief stop in Pearl Harbor, where the ship was resupplied and patched up, USS Franklin was deployed with Task Group 58.2 on March 3, 1945. The fleet was instructed to launch a large-scale attack on the Japanese homeland to support the landings in Okinawa. USS Franklin became the first American carrier to sail within 50 miles of the Japanese main island. Despite the weakened Japanese defenses, the U.S. carrier was on high alert, and her captain had ordered the crew to man battle stations 12 times in the span of just 6 hours. The crew was exhausted, and Garrus decided to decrease the alert level to Condition 3, allowing the sailors to eat and sleep, even though the gunners had to remain at their posts. But just as the crew began to relax, catastrophe struck. A lone Japanese bomber managed to pierce the American fleet's perimeter while hiding above cloud level. And just as Franklin's crew finished launching a wave of strike warplanes, the Japanese bomber dropped from the clouds and dove directly into the carrier's deck. Before the U.S. gunners could repel the attack, the enemy aircraft dropped 2 550-pound armor-piercing bombs on top of the U.S. ship. The warheads perforated the carrier's flight deck and then detonated in an overwhelming blast. Flames quickly spread throughout the ship, and scores of fully loaded warplanes began to cook off in the blazing heat. A destructive chain of detonations ensued, trapping hundreds of sailors below deck and disabling all of the ship's systems. Garrus refused to give the order to abandon the ship, but many sailors jumped to the water as they fled from the growing inferno on board Franklin. The explosions had destroyed the Combat Information Center and air plot and wrecked 3 of the carrier's decks. The warplanes on the flight deck soon started to explode, which caused their Tiny Tim air-to-surface rockets to ignite and ricochet off the flight deck, causing even more destruction. Despite the unfathomable desolation and the thick smoke that now covered the entirety of the ship, hundreds of sailors, including Navy Catholic chaplain Joseph Timothy O'Callaghan, refused to leave, venturing back into the bowels of the burning ship to help their crewmates. Cruisers USS Pittsburgh and USS Santa Fe, destroyers USS Miller, USS Hickox, USS Hunt, and USS Marshall immediately rushed to Franklin's positions to aid the damaged carrier. When the rest of the American commanders witnessed the devastation, they urged Captain Garrus to abandon the ship and scuttle her. However, knowing there were still hundreds of sailors below deck, Garrus refused to sink his own ship and instructed the remaining sailors to flood as many magazines as possible to prevent further explosions. The rest of the U.S. vessels began to rescue the men who had jumped off board, while several destroyers put their bows against the side of the burning carrier to save those trapped by the fire. Like Chaplain O'Callaghan, Lieutenant Junior Grade Donald A. Gary decided to stay on the burning wreck and ventured into the depth of the carrier, enduring the flames and smoke until he found 300 men trapped in a darkened mess hall. Gary then led them to safety and returned on several occasions to rescue more groups of sailors. At one point, he organized and led firefighting teams to quench the fires on the hangar deck and eventually reached the No. 3 fire room, releasing the steam in one boiler to prevent another explosion. Gary and O'Callaghan would later be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for their sacrifice and bravery. Thanks to the efforts of dozens of brave sailors, most of the 3,200 men on board Franklin survived. However, the catastrophe would claim the lives of over 800 men and injure another 265. After putting the fire under control, Franklin managed to sail on her own to Pearl Harbor, after which she traveled to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where she would spend months undergoing heavy repairs. For her gallant actions in the Pacific, USS Franklin received 4 battle stars for her service, and after repairs, she was displayed at the Navy Day celebrations. USS Franklin never returned to service and was decommissioned in February of 1947. She was finally scrapped in 1964. Despite the tremendous damage she suffered during the attack in March of 1945, Franklin earned the reputation of being an indestructible ship. The enemy considered her a ghost ship and claimed to have sunk her on 3 different occasions just to encounter her on the battlefront again. Ultimately, the ship became a symbol of American perseverance and determination during the war. The Marines and the Army's Wildcats were ready to storm the beaches of Peleliu and Angar and take the fight to the entrenched Japanese forces. Nevertheless, they had to wait for almost a week before disembarking. All they could do was contemplate how the mighty Tennessee-class battleship, with her impressive battery of 12 14-inch Mark IV guns, flattened the islands barrage after barrage. The Navy had been pummeling them for over 4 days, clearing bunkers, tunnels, mines, and any Japanese defenses. Tennessee roared without mercy, striking her objectives with pinpoint accuracy. Most of the young men thought there was not a single Japanese left on the island when they were ordered to prepare for combat on September 17, 1944. But they were wrong. The enemy was awaiting them, deep in the jungle. As the United States prepared to go to war against the Prussian Empire, the U.S. Navy ordered a new class of vessels inspired by the New Mexico class. This design was simply referred to as Battleship 1916. The Navy General Board sought to build a battleship that departed from the standard design of these warships, making room for improvements in armor, guns, and power plant. The Tennessee-class battleship design was approved in March 1915, and work on 2 ships began almost immediately. These were USS Tennessee and USS California. Both had a length of 600 feet, a beam of 97 feet, and a draft of 30 feet. They displaced over 33,000 long tons at full combat load. The ships incorporated 4 torpedo bulkheads to resist underwater attacks and absorb the pressure and gas of the explosion. Additionally, they were designed with a clipper bow to handle high seas and reduce spray. Following this concept, the Tennessee class featured extensive compartmentalization to reduce the risk of flooding, with over 760 compartments below the waterline and some 180 above it. The vessels had turboelectric drives with 8 oil-fired boilers, 2 Westinghouse turboelectric generators, and 4 electric motors that drove 4 3-bladed screws. The propulsion system generated over 28,000 shaft power, resulting in a top speed of 21 knots for the Tennessee battleships. The cruising range was 8,000 miles at an average speed of 10 knots, and could be extended to over 20,000 miles with increased fuel capacity. The standard crew consisted of 57 officers and 1,026 enlisted men. Built to last, she also needed to be armed. USS Tennessee had a main battery of 12 14-inch Mark IV guns in 4 triple turrets. The turrets allowed each barrel to elevate independently and had a maximum elevation of 30 degrees for long-range fire. The Mark IV guns had a range of 35,000 yards with 1,500-pound armor-piercing shells and up to 36,650 yards with a 1,275-pound high-capacity shell. The ship's secondary battery consisted of 14 5-inch guns. 6 guns were arranged to fire forward, and 4 were pointed aft. The other 4 were placed in open pivot mounts near the conning tower and the funnels. USS Tennessee was also armed with 4 Mark X 3-inch guns for anti-aircraft use, and 2 21-inch torpedo tubes fitted with Mark VII Bliss-Leavitt torpedoes with a range of 12,000 yards. The warship had an 8 to 13-inch thick armored belt and was almost 18 feet wide. The main belt was capped by armored transverse bulkheads that were 13.5 inches thick. The main battery guns had 18-inch thick faces, 10-inch thick sides, 9-inch thick rears, and 5-inch thick roofs. The conning towers had 16-inch thick sides and 6-inch thick roofs, and the armored coatings for the funnel uptakes were 9 inches thick. Her armament made her a force to be reckoned with, and this was soon put to the test. Tennessee was launched in April 1919 and participated in numerous training exercises throughout the 1920s and 1930s. In early 1941, she was transferred to the Pacific as tensions with the Empire of Japan escalated. She was moored along Battleship Row when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. During the attack, Tennessee was trapped by friendly vessels that received critical damage. Nevertheless, the crew reacted quickly and manned the anti-aircraft batteries to repel the Japanese strafing runs. She was attacked twice, but neither of the bombs detonated. Although some guns were deactivated and small fires erupted, Tennessee survived and was repaired and modernized in the following months. She was upgraded with air search radar and fire control radars, more powerful anti-aircraft guns, and a crew that increased to 114 officers and more than 2,000 men. In June 1943, Tennessee joined Task Force 16 to support the Aleutian Islands campaign and recapture Kiska and Attu from the Imperial Japanese Navy. She supported the pre-invasion bombardment of Kiska and fired 14-inch shells at what appeared to be an enemy submarine, but the sinking was never confirmed. USS Tennessee then covered the amphibious landings on Little Kiska Island, where the crew discovered the Japanese had already abandoned the area days before. Tennessee arrived at the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. While the U.S. Marines made their way to the beachheads to push back the Japanese from the beaches, USS Tennessee and Colorado opened fire to decimate the entrenched enemy and allow them to fight their way ashore. As the Leathernecks engaged the enemy at Tarawa, Tennessee left the combat zone at night to prevent a sneaky submarine attack. Nevertheless, the battleship kept providing anti-aircraft and direct fire support when the Marines requested it. During the battle, the ship made several hits against a Japanese submarine and sank it. In early January 1944, Tennessee received a fresh coat of dazzle camouflage before departing for the Marshall Islands. USS Tennessee and other ships bombarded the Kwajalein Atoll, destroying pillboxes, underground tunnels, and other fortifications near the beaches. She also dispatched her float planes to spot additional strongholds and shell them accurately. This helped the Marines enter the jungle with less enemy resistance. With the atoll secured, Tennessee made way for the Inuitak Atoll, where she led a preliminary bombardment alongside other U.S. Navy vessels. She employed her secondary battery to assist Marines in setting up marker buoys for assault craft. The battleship continued firing barrages until February 22nd, flattening the island almost entirely. Few structures remained standing. Leaving behind a trail of destruction that honored her powerful armament, USS Tennessee was dispatched to the Bismarck Archipelago in March 1944 to decimate Japanese bases in the area. In June 1944, USS Tennessee arrived at the Mariana Islands to participate in the Battle of Saipan. The powerful guns again roared and eradicated most Japanese beach defenses. She suppressed artillery pieces and mortar emplacements and helped friendly minesweepers clear the way for landing craft. With Saipan cleared for the Marines to take it, the crew of Tennessee was called to action in July to assist with capturing Tinian and Guam. Alongside other Navy vessels, Tennessee opened fire from around 2,500 yards, providing cover for the Marines disembarking on the beaches of Tinian. USS Tennessee and California destroyed Tinian town with a barrage of over 500 rounds from their main batteries, forcing the Japanese to fight from their tunnels. After a quick refuel, Tennessee headed for the Palau Islands to participate in Operation Forager and Stalemate. The objective was to capture the two islands to secure and build airfields that B-24 bombers could use to strike the Philippines. Capturing Peleliu fell to the iconic 1st Division of the Marines. In contrast, Angar would be captured by the Army's 81st Infantry Division, commonly called the Wildcats. The Marines stormed Peleliu on September 16, 1944, to fight Colonel Kunio Nakagawa's 11,000 men. The initial stage was ferocious, but the Marines made do after suffering countless casualties. The next day, the Wildcats prepared for combat and stormed Angar after a preliminary bombardment from USS Tennessee, Pennsylvania, 5 destroyers, and 4 cruisers. The Wildcats numbered over 10,000 men, pitched against Lieutenant General Sade Inoue and Major Goto's 1,400 soldiers from the 59th Infantry Regiment, 14th Infantry Division. The men were seasoned soldiers from the war in Manchuria and were ready to fight to the last man to honor the Emperor. Major General Paul J. Mueller addressed his men before battle, stating, quote, "We are on the eve of seizing an important strategic area from the Japanese. On our shoulders rest grave responsibilities. What we do in this battle will be no small contribution to the glory of our country. Major Ushio Goto spent most of his assets on the sectors where he believed the enemy would land. He braced for impact as Tennessee pummeled the island with her main guns. The Wildcats disembarked without difficulty, but were pinned down once they ventured into the island's center. The outnumbered Japanese defenders did everything they could to decimate the Americans, but lacked the proper supplies and numbers to lead successful attacks. Meanwhile, Tennessee and her crew kept providing fire support. War correspondent John Walker later reported to Time magazine, quote, "We hear the blast of the big guns and the ripping silk sound of the heavy shells sailing to their targets. We see the warships with halos of yellow smoke and the bursts of fire and black smoke back on the beach." The island was captured on September 20th, allowing Tennessee to leave the area and refuel. The U.S. forces quickly began building the much-needed airfields, but they were not ready in time for the invasion of the Philippines. Many Army and Marine officers later questioned the operation, with some considering it an unnecessary loss of American lives. Nevertheless, the Wildcats were transferred to Peleliu to help the Marines finish the fight. As for USS Tennessee, she would see combat at Leyte Gulf, Surigao Strait, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa before being sold for scrap in 1959. She remains one of the few U.S. Navy vessels that saw combat in most of the Pacific campaigns, from the bombing of Pearl Harbor to the last Japanese defense at Okinawa. USS North Carolina, the lead ship of her class, emerged from the horizon, slicing through the waves with determination. Her 9 16-inch guns thundered, hurling 2,700-pound shells toward the distant enemy. The Imperial Japanese Navy fleet approached without hesitation for the dominion of the Pacific. With her engines throbbing, North Carolina charged, guns blazing, to open a gap in the enemy lines. North Carolina's objective was easier said than done: protect the U.S. Navy's aircraft carriers at all costs. As both task forces clashed, her mission turned more difficult. Japanese aircraft swarmed the U.S. vessels, ready to strike them down with either conventional bombs or devastating kamikaze attacks. Still, North Carolina, in her protector role, did not flinch and opened fire with more than 40 guns from her secondary armament. The sky soon turned into a deadly maze of anti-aircraft fire, smoke, and gunfire from American and Japanese fighters. Despite the relentless Japanese waves, North Carolina's thick armor openly defied the enemy bombs and torpedoes, with her crew focused on safeguarding the task force from being scattered by the enemy. USS North Carolina fired salvo after salvo until her barrels ran hot, fending off her attackers as the sun went down. USS North Carolina's keel was laid on Navy Day in October 1937 at the New York Navy Yard in Brooklyn. Her hull was so large by Navy standards at the time that the building ways had to be lengthened and strengthened to accommodate the lead ship of the new battleship class. The vessel was launched on June 13, 1940. During the launch ceremony, Clyde Hoey, governor of North Carolina, said, quote, "Its very power is fascinating. It commands our respect and will help us command the respect of the world. It speaks a language even a dictator can understand." On April 9, 1941, USS North Carolina, the world's fightingest ship, was commissioned in the New York Navy Yard, receiving praise from all major American outlets. Regarding the event, the Young Catholic Messenger wrote, quote, "The 35,000-ton battleship, North Carolina, solid gleaming symbol of America's awakening from a sleepy naval holiday of 18 years. As bugles blared and white-capped officers in blue jackets saluted, a pennant was run slowly up the flagstaff to show that the ship was in commission. Millions listened over the radio as the mightiest battleship afloat was put into service." BB-55 stood as the lead ship of her class, a symbol of cutting-edge naval design. Her imposing silhouette stretched over 700 feet. Armed to the teeth, she boasted 9 16-inch guns. Complementing her main battery were 25-inch guns, both anti-aircraft and dual-purpose, fortifying her against aerial assaults. North Carolina's beating heart lay in her robust power plant, a quartet of oil-fired steam turbines propelling her to a speed of 28 knots. Nevertheless, what truly set North Carolina apart from other ships of her time was a revolutionary protection scheme, which comprised a specialized system of armored belts and decks that shielded her vital machinery and personnel from enemy projectiles. Fondly nicknamed the Showboat, BB-55 spent months testing her systems and undergoing sea trials, following her commission into the U.S. Navy fleet in April 1941. Under the command of her first captain, Olaf M. Hustvedt, North Carolina departed to the Caribbean Sea for her shakedown cruise. Following the surprise Japanese attack against Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States declared war on Japan and Germany. Consequently, BB-55 was ordered to the Pacific Theater for immediate retaliation against the Asian enemy. But first, she was deployed to Naval Station Argentia, Newfoundland, in the Atlantic in April 1942 to block a possible sortie from the German Kriegsmarine's battleship Tirpitz. There were rumors of the imposing commerce raider hunting convoy lanes in the vicinity, but she was never sighted by the Allied forces. Thus, North Carolina departed for the Pacific, arriving in Pearl Harbor on July 11, 1942. Fire Controlman First Class Larry Resin later recalled that upon arrival, quote, "The crews cheered and cheered us. I couldn't help saying to myself, they're cheering us for nothing. We hadn't done anything. We had not fired a single shot yet. But to them, we were the symbol of help finally arriving in force." The Showboat was assigned to Task Force 61 and dispatched to join the fight at Guadalcanal with the help of aircraft carrier Enterprise, light cruiser Atlanta, heavy cruiser Portland, and other destroyers. North Carolina provided critical cover for the landings of the 1st Marine Division. The Leatherneck's objective was simple: seizing the airfield constructed by the Japanese. In addition, North Carolina's batteries and armament roared to protect carrier Enterprise and her aircraft. At the same time, they engaged ground and air targets. The battleship support was also important to soften up the Japanese stronghold to Lucky Island. Still, not everything proceeded as planned. The Japanese dispatched a cruiser squadron that attacked the U.S. Navy fleet during the night of August 9, 1942, defeating them during the Battle of Savo Island. USS North Carolina protected carrier task forces from further Japanese incursions. The Showboat proved her worth during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, which raged on from August 24th to 25th and saw ferocious encounters between carrier forces from both armies. After sinking the light carrier Ryujo, the Imperial Japanese launched a daring counterattack that was detected by North Carolina's radar. The enemy focused all their efforts on USS Enterprise, sending waves of aircraft and fire against her. As her protector, North Carolina provided as much anti-aircraft fire as possible to cover Enterprise's evasive maneuvers. Several enemy fighters and bombers were shot down, forcing the Japanese to divert their squadrons and strafe directly for North Carolina. Several Aichi D-3A dive bombers attempted to drop their bomb load over North Carolina, but she emerged unscratched from the encounter. The next enemy wave was more successful, taking the life of one sailor and hitting the ship with 3 bombs that did some minor damage. During the engagement against the Japanese carriers, North Carolina took down 8 and 14 enemy aircraft. Following the end of the battle, North Carolina returned to the waters of Guadalcanal to continue guarding the island's Army and Marine Corps units. Imperial Japanese Navy submarines torpedoed the battleship on September 6th. One passed the ship 300 yards off her port side, sparing her from doom. Still, a second strike of 6 torpedoes fired from submarine I-19 on September 15th scored a direct hit on her port side. The hit opened a 32 by 18-foot hole below the waterline, leading to the loss of 5 sailors and a temporary failure that disabled the forward turret. The battleship listed 5.5 degrees to port due to flooding, but kept her bearing and withdrew to Pearl Harbor for repairs. The other ships that comprised the task force were not so lucky. USS Wasp was scuttled, and USS O'Brien sank later due to suffering extensive damage. The Showboat underwent repairs from September to November 1942 before joining USS Saratoga and Enterprise for convoy escort operations in the Solomons. As part of Task Force 64, North Carolina guarded ships that delivered troops and supplies for the men fighting at Guadalcanal during the rest of 1942 and the early months of 1943. She then returned to a safe port for a refit and the installation of more sophisticated radars in preparation for the upcoming Allied landings on the Gilbert Islands. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Pacific waters with intense hues, North Carolina stood high among the members of Task Force 50.2. The mission was clear: support the assaults on the Gilberts and Marshall Islands, which include Tarawa, Macon, and Apamama. With the support of additional vessels, North Carolina stormed hostile waters and raided the islands in November 1943. As the turmoil of war raged on, her cannons roared time and time again to silence the Japanese guns concealed deep inside the jungles. Besides her naval artillery bombardments to pummel enemy fortifications, the showboat filled the horizon with fire and smoke, shielding the U.S. carriers from enemy aircraft. December 8th brought a new directive. Detached from the fleet, North Carolina now sailed with her fellow Massachusetts, Indiana, South Dakota, and Washington for the Marianas under the command of Admiral Mitcher. Nauru Island was the last objective to be decimated before North Carolina departed for the new campaign. On January 6, 1944, North Carolina and the task force were quick to engage the might of Japan during the Battle of Kwajalein, where she unleashed her wrath with multiple preparatory bombardments. The battleship then momentarily abandoned the carriers and steamed toward Roy Namur, where her guns struck the Japanese with lethal accuracy, eliminating the enemy with swift and consistent blows. North Carolina became part of Operation Hailstone to raid the island of Truk, the Empire's most important staging area in the region. Once again, Task Force 58.3 and North Carolina pummeled the enemy fortifications, raining down havoc without truce, leaving Truk's might shattered for the rest of the conflict. What followed was a series of island raids to suffocate Japanese strongholds. The Pacific became North Carolina's playground. From Palau to Waliai and Hollandia to Truk, the battleship's guns roared with determination, eliminating anything that stood in her way. From Japanese aircraft to island fortifications, the sky and the ground trembled with each salvo fired, signaling the enemy that the showboat was there to stay until the last enemy surrendered. After a refit in May 1944, North Carolina was back in the game to strike the Marianas. Task Group 58.7 was distributed between 4 carrier task groups, which began the assault against the island of Saipan on June 6, 1944. North Carolina's main battery bombarded the island mercilessly to soften up the defenses for the U.S. Marines and protect the minesweepers that cleared the path for the beachhead. North Carolina's guns also screened the carriers. They later shelled Tonopah Harbor, destroying vital enemy supply dumps and sinking small Japanese vessels. The Japanese attempted a naval counterattack, but failed to achieve any considerable gap, with North Carolina fending off a wave of enemy aircraft. The Imperial Navy struck harder a second time with the 1st Mobile Fleet, the main carrier strike force. North Carolina and her group steamed toward the enemy and clashed on June 18th in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which raged for 2 days. With the support of 4 cruisers and 13 destroyers, North Carolina resisted the first enemy blow, leading her to counterattack with lethal anti-aircraft fire. Although the battle was fought primarily by the carriers, North Carolina and the rest of the U.S. Navy fleet inflicted serious losses on the Japanese, destroying hundreds of their aircraft and sinking 3 carriers, crippling the Imperial Navy for the remainder of the war. In the course of the naval engagements, North Carolina shot down 2 Japanese aircraft and incapacitated countless others. Following an overhaul at the Puget Sound Navy Yard in North Carolina, her seasoned crew once again set sail to attack the Japanese scattered around the Philippines. As part of Task Group 38.3, North Carolina launched strikes on Japanese positions in Leyte, Luzon, and the Visayas. During these assaults, North Carolina survived a kamikaze attack by shooting down the aircraft before it got within range. On December 18, 1944, the Typhoon Cobra struck North Carolina's group, but she survived nature's encounter unscathed. Still, there was no rest for the colossal battleship. In January 1945, she struck Formosa, Indochina, and China, decimating the Japanese garrisons. 1 month later, North Carolina guarded Navy carriers attacking Honshu. As the U.S. military got closer to mainland Japan, she began to support attacks on Tokyo and the Bonin Islands. In April, during the onslaught of Okinawa, North Carolina fended off several kamikaze assaults, taking down 3 in the intense aerial engagements. Weeks later, an intense air-naval counterattack, led by the waning Japanese military, was met with North Carolina's iron will. As the destruction of Japan continued without any signs of surrender, the U.S. began targeting Tokyo. With Japan burning, the Navy Task Group withdrew from Japan as another typhoon reached the homeland. Then came the surrender after the 2 atomic bombs. The imposing and veteran battleship occupied Japan in the aftermath, before returning to the United States to wrap up her legendary wartime service. USS North Carolina was decommissioned in New York on June 27, 1947. She remained a training vessel for midshipmen, and later went to Bayonne, New Jersey, to become part of the inactive reserve fleet. The Navy tried modernizing the vessel, but the program was canceled in the 1950s. A decade later, the battleship was bound for the scrapyard, but the state citizens launched a campaign to preserve the iconic World War II vessel. Funds were raised to prepare a berth and move North Carolina from Bayonne to Wilmington. The campaign saved the ship, and the showboat arrived at Cape Fear River near Southport, North Carolina in October 1961. She was then modified and preserved as the state's war memorial. North Carolina's legacy and her 12 battle stars live on until this very day, with the thousands of visitors she receives each year to honor the men who gave their lives for history's most devastating conflict. On the evening of November 14, 1942, as darkness enveloped the Pacific, the battleships USS South Dakota and Washington and 4 destroyers embarked on a covert mission under Vice Admiral Willis A. Lee to intercept a significant Japanese fleet near Savo Island. Leading a group of destroyers and cruisers was the battleship Kirishima, one of the mightiest ships of the Empire. The guns on both sides roared to life, ripping holes into hulls and decks. The Japanese ships lined up and moved in to perform what they believed to be a coup de grace on the Americans. Not to be outdone, South Dakota and Washington mirrored the move. However, as South Dakota was about to enter the fray, a sudden blackout struck, disabling her radar and cutting off communication with Washington, vital for the safety of her crew. Unwilling to give up, Captain Thomas Gatch, an eccentric yet beloved leader, decided to steam ahead anyway, trusting his expertly trained crew of wild men to rise to the occasion. Now, with both fleets mere thousands of yards apart, a rare event in World War II and naval history as a whole was about to ensue, a battleship versus battleship showdown. In 1938, as the Japanese Empire rejected all naval treaty obligations, the United States Congress agreed to fund major shipbuilding programs. By then, aircraft and submarines made Navy battleships much more vulnerable than in World War I, where their only other adversaries were ships of their kind. As such, new generations of modernized battleships like the South Dakota class had thicker armored decks and much more firepower, meant to make it harder for airplanes and submarines to catch and destroy them. Displacing a whopping 35,000 tons, South Dakota, the first of her class, was the heaviest United States ship ever constructed. Despite being nearly 700 feet long, the vessel dashed through the seas at a top speed of 27 knots, placing it in the fast battleship category of the Navy. These ships were expected to participate in task forces alongside aircraft carriers, protecting them and destroying everything that posed a threat. Worsening relations between America and Japan hurried the construction of South Dakota, and when it was completed, the public was not allowed to attend the launching ceremony. Sure enough, by the time the battleship was ready for sea duty in August 1942, the United States was at war against the Axis powers. On August 16, 1942, exactly 3 years to the day before Japan's surrender, South Dakota and her 115 officers and 1,678-man crew began a long voyage towards the waters of the South Pacific. The battleship's first-ever commander was Captain Thomas L. Gatch, a known eccentric, admirer of Shakespearean sonnets, and an American Civil War connoisseur. With no previous combat experience, he quickly adapted, championing the philosophy that the primary role of battleships like the South Dakota was to decisively destroy enemy vessels and aircraft. As such, the skipper prioritized gunnery training at the expense of nearly every other task on his ship. Throughout the voyage, to ensure that their skills were honed to perfection, Gatch frequently summoned his crew to battle stations to drill with the ship's 16-inch guns, which fired massive shells weighing over a ton across a range of nearly 30,000 yards. With the constant drilling and practice, the men's gun handling skills improved quickly, and this speedy training earned the captain the nickname Gunpowder Gatch. Historians and former sailors agree that Gatch was an exceptional captain, adored by all his men for his unique leadership role. Gatch's leadership style was unconventional. He cared little for the traditional naval emphasis on appearance, allowing his crew the freedom to dress more casually. This approach fostered a unique camaraderie and a sense of rugged individualism among the sailors, often described as wild men. While the ship was often dirty, this did not imply a lack of discipline or readiness. The ship's guns were meticulously maintained. These unique rules and ways of living earned South Dakota a reputation unique among the Navy's battleships. But despite the somewhat unorthodox practices, as the battleship finally neared warfare waters, according to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison, quote, "No ship more eager to fight ever entered the Pacific. For Captain Gatch, by exercising a natural gift for leadership, had welded the Green crew into a splendid fighting team. While on the way to the Solomon Islands, the battleship struck a reef, and the damage caused it to travel to Pearl Harbor for repairs. But this incident may have been a blessing in disguise, as workers also replaced the ship's anti-aircraft guns with highly effective 40mm models in quad mounts. By October 1942, South Dakota was finally on her way, just in time for the most heated moments of the Battle of Guadalcanal. As the end of the month approached, the Japanese troops were desperately trying to drive the Americans out of their land and into the sea, where a large fleet of carriers, led by their fiercest Empire commanders, was ready to strike and sweep away any American unit that stood in their way. And even though the U.S. Navy was still perfecting its air attack defense tactics, Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, consisting of South Dakota, carrier USS Enterprise, 2 cruisers, and 8 destroyers, was ready to fight. On October 26th, in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, as the prime target, Enterprise was quickly swarmed by a dizzying volume of Japanese aircraft coming from all sides. Maneuvering as fast as possible to get close to the Big E, the men of South Dakota finally put their grueling gunnery training to good use and unleashed all the anti-aircraft fire they could, claiming 32 enemy warplanes destroyed, but officially credited with 26. This came at a cost, for the battleship would not escape the battle unscathed. Amid the anti-aircraft melee, a massive 500-pound bomb hit the vessel's main gun turret. While the gun mount was so heavily protected that the gun crew did not notice the damage, the men near the bridge, including Captain Gatch himself, surely did. Severely injured in the jugular, 2 quartermasters quickly rushed in to save the life of their beloved skipper. Back on the damaged bridge, the heat of the moment caused a communication mishap that caused the ship to lose control and nearly collide with Enterprise, with the latter maneuvering at the very last minute to avoid it. With the skipper out of the fight, the executive officers stepped up and stabilized the situation, resuming their protective role over the task force. But the scene was still chaotic, and the men of South Dakota, still extremely focused and stressed out of their minds, accidentally fired upon 6 SBD dive bombers returning to their carrier. This incident sparked a unique reputation for South Dakota: shoot first, ask questions later. According to Navy veteran Donald Young, Navy pilots had a simple rule regarding the South Dakota-class battleship, quote, "Don't fly anywhere near that big so-and-so. She'll shoot you down." Although the Americans suffered heavy losses, the battle for Santa Cruz forced the Japanese to move northward and away from the island. On the morning of November 14th, South Dakota was about to embark on her wildest adventure yet. When the Japanese group attacked a field in Guadalcanal Island, Task Force 64 steamed right towards the attackers, led by Admiral Lee, made up of Enterprise, Battleship Washington, and South Dakota, with the heated Captain Gatch back in command. But as the sun set, knowing the Big E could not perform nighttime air ops, Lee commanded the 2 battleships and 4 destroyers to look for and destroy the enemy. Shortly before midnight, around Savo Island, the duo of battleships encountered the angered group of enemy destroyers and cruisers, which quickly unleashed their power and damaged all ships. As a duo of heavy cruisers and battleship Kirishima closed in for a showdown, Washington and South Dakota did the same. But as the latter steamed towards them, all electrical power was lost to a malfunction, leading to a radar error throughout the rest of the fight. Now, with no way of contacting Washington directly, South Dakota and her men had no choice but to face the darkness directly, steaming right towards the Japanese vessels as the enemy fired nearly 3 dozen torpedoes. And as the smoke cleared, the American battleship remained unscathed. But the worst was yet to come. Now, with South Dakota only 5,000 yards away from the Japanese task force, the enemy shined their lights upon it and fired mercilessly. While battleship versus battleship is a rare occurrence in World War II, on that fateful day, this was the reality for Gatch and his men. Despite all their best work, they could not stop the enemy from scoring 42 hits, causing many casualties and wounded. South Dakota was severely damaged and in deep trouble. But this carnage had a silver lining, as the fire and noise from the battleship-to-battleship encounter allowed Washington to spot the positions of every ship. And so, in retribution for their beleaguered comrade, Washington unleashed her main battery, reducing Kirishima to a ball of flame, while the heavily damaged South Dakota escaped the battle at full speed, as did most of the other surviving Japanese ships. As dawn broke in the accorded rendezvous point, Washington's crew was uncertain of South Dakota's fate after her bold nighttime escape. The hours stretched on, with vigilant eyes scouring the horizon for the battleship's silhouette. Then, precisely at 9 a.m., the agreed-upon time for the meetup, battered yet undefeated, South Dakota made her timely appearance, reuniting with Washington, her fellow battleship and savior. The damage from the encounter that South Dakota suffered was serious enough she had to return to the mainland for repairs. Once at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the battleship, Gatch, and his crew received plenty of attention from the hero-seeking press and media. But on the other side of the world, the rapid disappearance of the battleship after what became the Second Battle of Savo Island caused the Imperial Navy to believe South Dakota was sunk during that fierce fight. Even further back than that, Japanese aviators also reported the battleship as lost in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Because of this mysterious backstory, American naval intelligence chose to encourage the misinformation, and for a long time, instead of South Dakota, this now reputable vessel was merely identified as Battleship X in dispatches and other official documents. Throughout the conflict, the Western press referred to the ship as Old Nameless, but to the sailors aboard, those who truly knew her, she was simply dear old Sodak. After 2 months of repairs, Sodak was again ready for sea duty, this time with a new captain, Lynd McCormick. In the summer of 1943, she traveled all the way to the Atlantic Theater, where she joined one of the many Allied efforts to hunt one of the Kriegsmarine's most iconic ships, the Tirpitz. As the elusive battleship wreaked havoc with convoys on the Murmansk run, threatening to shut it down altogether, Allied war planning came up with the idea to use the ultra-fast American Navy battleships that had already proved their mettle in the South Pacific to lure the German vessel into a head-to-head battle where aircraft could finish her off. However, when the plan failed to materialize after 2 months, South Dakota had no choice but to head back to the Pacific. There, the battleship returned to a naval war in which the United States was clearly gaining the upper hand against the Empire. However, there was still some fighting to be done. Between mid-November 1943 and June 1944, the ship participated in actions in the Caroline Islands against a sizable Japanese base at Truk and in support of marine landings on the Mariana Islands, mostly providing anti-aircraft protection. During the iconic Marianas Turkey Shoot, where the Allies accounted for over 400 Japanese planes in a single day on June 19, 1944, South Dakota was the only major ship that suffered damage, as a 500-pound bomb hit the captain's quarters and injured over 50 men. After a refit, the battleship returned to the war, albeit with some new crew members, including Alan Vernon Robinson, a journalist turned sailor who chronicled South Dakota's final year of operation in World War II. In late September, as the Allies attempted to capture each of the Marianas Islands, Leyte Island, the easternmost atoll in the chain, was taken virtually without opposition. However, Peleliu was much more heavily defended, and the struggle required 2 of the harshest months for the crew of USS South Dakota. Speaking about the fear and uncertainty he and his fellow sailors felt, Robinson described it as, quote, "You didn't always know what the enemy had in mind, and what might start as small and insignificant may turn into something you were most totally unprepared for." Thankfully, luck remained on South Dakota's side. From late 1944 on, as the fierce engagement South Dakota's men fought became less frequent, the battleship served mainly as a carrier escort and provided shore bombardment, mainly on Okinawa and in the Philippines. On July 14, 1945, Sodak became the first enemy warship in nearly a century to fire directly upon the Japanese mainland. As night fell on August 10, 1945, after finishing a bombardment of Kamai-Shihad, the crew had barely survived a kamikaze attack and were ready to spend the rest of the day relaxing when they were notified of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs from a few days before. In an essay, Robinson spoke of that iconic day, quote, "We expected the war to end suddenly, untrumpeted and without ceremony. For us, it did that, but we did not expect it to end when it did. It was 8:55 p.m. on the night of August 10, 1945, that this bad dream came to an end for us. Shouts, screams, and impromptu celebrations reverberated throughout the ship. It was too good to be true, but it was." South Dakota was one of the American vessels on Tokyo Bay. On September 2, 1945, when Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz officially accepted the surrender of the Japanese Empire. By the time the battleship left the bay a few days later, she'd traveled 246,970 miles, nearly the same distance from the Earth to the Moon, having claimed 3 ships and 64 airplanes, an outstanding 13 Navy battle stars, and changing the lives of the hundreds of men who lived and served aboard USS South Dakota. In the tumultuous waters of the North Sea, April 8, 1940, a David and Goliath showdown was about to unfold. HMS Glowworm, a British destroyer weighing a mere 1,345 tons, found herself isolated from her fleet. As fate would have it, she would soon confront the colossal 10,000-ton German cruiser Admiral Hipper. The disparity was evident, not just in size, but in firepower. Hipper boasted 8 8-inch guns, 12 4.1-inch guns, and 12 37mm guns, dwarfing Glowworm's 4 4.7-inch guns. Glowworm's journey to this confrontation was marred by misfortune. She had lost contact with the main British force while searching for a man swept overboard in rough seas. Her gyro compass failed, and she had to navigate using a magnetic compass. As dawn broke, she spotted an unidentified destroyer, which soon revealed its hostile intent. The battle that ensued was fierce and relentless. Glowworm, despite being outgunned, drove ahead. Her decks were set ablaze, her hull battered, and yet she persisted. The German cruiser, with its superior firepower, rained down shells on the British destroyer. But Glowworm's captain, Lieutenant Commander Gerard Roop, had a final card to play. As the distance between the two warships closed, Glowworm's intent became clear. She was going to ram the German cruiser. The Royal Navy's 1933 construction program led to the order of a new destroyer, which became the Gallant-class destroyer Glowworm. Constructed at John I. Thornycroft and Company in Woolston, Hampshire, Glowworm was launched on July 22, 1935, and completed on January 22, 1936. With a weight of 1,350 long tons and 1,883 long tons fully loaded, Glowworm measured 323 feet in length, 33 feet in beam, and had a draft of 12 feet 5 inches. Powered by steam turbines, generating 34,000 shaft horsepower through 2 shafts, she could reach a maximum range of 5,530 nautical miles at 15 knots. Glowworm initially joined the first destroyer flotilla of the Mediterranean Fleet and took part in escort missions, including the escort of King Edward VIII on his cruise in the eastern Mediterranean. During the Spanish Civil War, the destroyer patrolled Spanish waters to enforce the Non-Intervention Committee's edicts. During night exercises, Glowworm also had incidents, like a collision with her sister ship, Grenade, but repairs were successfully carried out. When World War II began with Germany's invasion of Poland in September 1939, Glowworm was stationed in Alexandria. In October, her flotilla was transferred to the Western Approaches Command, and she sailed to the UK with her sister ships. The flotilla was assigned to the southwestern approaches, where they escorted convoys and conducted anti-submarine patrols. Despite being smaller in size compared to other destroyers, Glowworm proved her worth with her impressive speed at 36 knots. Armed with 4 4.7-inch guns, anti-aircraft weapons, depth charges, and 4 torpedo tubes, she was well equipped for various tasks. She was also a test ship for the new quintuple torpedo tube mounts for 21-inch torpedoes and carried up to 35 depth charges for defense. Towards the end of 1939, Glowworm was transferred to Harwich and joined the 22nd Destroyer Flotilla to continue her patrol work in the North Sea. In early 1940, Glowworm suffered structural damage after being hit by a Swedish ship while sailing through fog. After repairs in Hull, she rejoined the home fleet at its base in Scapa Flow. Then on April 5th, she was part of the escort for the battlecruiser Renown during Operation Wilfred in Norwegian waters, tasked with covering mine-laying operations in the disputed waters. But then, Hitler unexpectedly invaded Norway, catching the British off guard. The British response was cautious, as they didn't want to intervene in Norwegian affairs until it was clear that Germany would violate Norway's neutrality. Most British units stayed far away from Norwegian shores to prevent any German advances into the Atlantic. However, the safety of precious convoys destined for Britain remained the top priority for the Admiralty. Meanwhile, closer to the Norwegian coast, small Royal Navy units ventured north to lay mines off Norwegian ports and search for the German invasion force. During this mission, tragedy struck when a torpedo man named Ricky fell overboard from Glowworm during a fierce storm on April 6th. Concerned about the lost crew member, Glowworm's captain sought permission to leave the main group and search for the missing man, but she never came back. 2 days after sailing with her sisters, the destroyer was detached to search for the man lost overboard. Despite their efforts, they couldn't find him in the treacherous sea. As Glowworm attempted to rejoin Renown and the rest of the escort, they lost all contact due to the challenging conditions. The situation grew tense, and the weather got worse, forcing Glowworm to slow down to less than 10 knots. Adding to the difficulties, the ship's gyro compass stopped working, and they had to rely on a magnetic compass to steer their way. The next morning, another sailor went missing. This time around, the man was found tangled in ropes trailing over the side. But the crew knew what this meant. The man was doomed, and so was the entire ship. As a sailor commented years later, quote, "Well, that was a bad omen indeed. For 2 consecutive mornings, something nasty had happened, and we were all asking what the third morning would bring." That gloomy morning, standing on the ship's pitching bridge, was Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmead Roop. At just 35 years old, he was already a seasoned seaman in the esteemed Royal Navy. His crew admired and respected him, affectionately calling him Ardover. He had a widespread reputation for making sudden and dramatic changes in course. Despite the difficulties, the crew stayed hopeful and tried to rendezvous with another group of British ships. Knowing that German units were nearby, they remained vigilant. But nothing could have prepared them for the epic encounter they would find on their path. As the sun struggled to rise, a dim light enveloped the ocean. In that eerie dawn, their ship unexpectedly collided with not one, but 2 huge German fleet destroyers, named Paul Jacobi and Bernd von Arnim. To make matters worse, the nearest German ship sent a confusing signal, claiming to be a Swedish vessel. But before anyone could comprehend what was happening, the enemy opened fire on Glowworm. Roop and his crew found themselves in a perilous battle against the powerful German destroyers. In Ramsay's words, quote, "Glowworm began her gallant fight, against odds from the start." On paper, Glowworm was not fit to fight on even terms with her opponents, with 5 5-inch guns and 8 torpedo tubes. In spite of the odds, Roop took on Jacobi, firing non-stop. Although the heavy seas flooded her gun director tower, she struck at least once. The relentless tides hammered the tiny ship, making accurate shooting increasingly difficult. The battle was intense, with the destroyers zigzagging at high speed, firing their guns at each other. The rough seas made it even more challenging for Glowworm, and they lost 2 crew members overboard. But they didn't back down. Suddenly, the German ships, both crammed with soldiers of the Norwegian invasion force, turned away. Then, it became evident to the crew that the Glowworm was doomed. As Ramsay later described, quote, "They were obviously trying to lead us on to something more powerful." Their brave captain, Roop, decided to continue their quest at all costs. Glowworm kept following the enemy ships, determined to gather information about the German fleet's movements and report back to their own forces. But soon, they encountered a much larger and more powerful enemy some 5 miles north-northwest, through the gloom, spray, and mist, the cruiser Hipper. Normally, he would have tried to follow and keep an eye on the mighty German ship. However, the weather was terrible, making it almost impossible to stay close to his opponent. So Roop decided to take a stand and confront the big German ship head-on. Hipper, bound for Norway and loaded with troops, was heavily armed with massive guns, posing a daunting threat to Roop's ship. But Roop was not discouraged. He was determined to fight back and inflict as much damage as he could. The battle commenced, and despite firing their torpedoes, Glowworm shots fell short and couldn't reach the distant Hipper. It was a fierce and heroic struggle, and Roop knew he had to use every bit of skill and courage to hold his ground against the powerful enemy. The situation looked dire, and the brave crew of Glowworm knew their fate was sealed. Roop had one and only one purpose: to inflict as much damage as possible on the enemy before the inevitable end. Indeed, Hipper was pouring 8-inch shells at the helpless little ship with merciless might. So, in the lieutenant's words, quote, "We made smoke and began to close the enemy cruiser. When we got within range, I fired our torpedoes." 2 attacks were launched, but both times the 10 torpedoes missed their mark. Glowworm, now ablaze with a massive fire in the engine room, was on the verge of defeat. However, the captain of the Glowworm and his tiny crew were no ordinary sailors. They belonged to the Royal Navy, carrying on the honorable traditions of Grenville, Nelson, Rodney, Drake, and Jellicoe. Despite the odds stacked against them, they were determined to fight to the very end. As the fight raged on, the Glowworm suffered significant damage. One of her guns was disabled, the rangefinder was hit, and the mast's upper yard collapsed, causing sirens to wail futilely, which thereafter screamed incessantly amidst the chaos of smoke and cordite. In the face of adversity, Roop made a daring decision. He chose to ram Hipper. In the midst of chaotic explosions, Glowworm's radio room transmitted crucial information. Large German units were nearing the coast of Trondheim. The message reached London's Admiralty, who understood that the invasion of Norway had begun. Glowworm had fulfilled her important mission, and now she faced her final moments with bravery and determination. Sinking and burning, and with her fragile hull, Glowworm painfully altered course. Composed and calmed, Roop turned to his helmsman and ordered, quote, "Ram her." At 20 knots, she sailed straight into the side of Hipper. Now it was the Germans who could not answer quickly enough to avoid the charge in the raging seas. Risking everything in a single, last-resort, decisive move, Glowworm aimed for the enemy's starboard side. Despite facing a barrage of enemy fire, the destroyer steamed ahead. With a tremendous crunch, the destroyer's bow collided with the armor plating of the cruiser. The impact sent men sprawling across the deck amid blood, seawater, fire, and smoke. Nevertheless, those who could still stand picked themselves up and continued to fight. Glowworm jammed her prow deep into the cruiser's flank, just behind her anchor, ripping away some 130 feet of her armored side. Although the enemy remained in the fight, she was listing, with 500 tons of icy North Sea water weighing her down. Listing badly, Glowworm drifted away from her wounded enemy, leaving a dense cloud of smoke behind. As Glowworm pulled away from Hipper, they managed to fire back and even scored a hit at a close range of 400 yards. But the damage to their own ship was extensive. The bows were severely damaged, several shells had penetrated critical areas, and the aft superstructure was wrecked. Then, a German bombardment relentlessly pounded the sinking destroyer. The ship was in less than ideal shape, with a raging fire in the engine room causing it to tilt forward. Despite the dire situation, Petty Officer Scott, in charge of the last working gun, bravely continued firing at the enemy ship. On the bridge, Roop remained calm, smoking a cigarette, but he knew it was time to prioritize the safety of his crew. He gave the order to abandon the ship, and the sailors started making their way into the freezing water. The captain, though injured, showed remarkable leadership and helped with the evacuation efforts. The crew did their best to assist the wounded, fitting them with life belts in hopes they could stay afloat. As they struggled in the rough sea, disaster struck. Glowworm exploded and overturned, plunging those who were still alive into the icy waters filled with fuel oil. Among them was Commander Roop, now on the ship's keel, who remarked to a petty officer that they wouldn't be playing cricket anytime soon. Captain Helmut Hay of Hipper immediately sprang into action, doing everything possible to rescue the men in the water. He positioned his ship downwind of the sinking destroyer, allowing the exhausted survivors to get closer to safety. Despite the treacherous conditions, Hay's crew, along with some German soldiers, worked together to pull the men out of the water. Unfortunately, many of the Glowworm's crew were too weak and cold to hold on to the life ropes, and some slipped away and vanished into the waves. Among the survivors was Lieutenant Robert Ramsey, the torpedo officer, who was the only officer to make it through. The Germans treated the survivors with great respect, providing them with blankets and massages to help them recover. As for Roop, he fought valiantly to save his men, but in the end, he succumbed to exhaustion and the freezing cold. Captain Hay showed remarkable compassion by keeping his ship over the side of the disaster for more than an hour, ensuring that every possible survivor was rescued. The brave actions of the Glowworm did not go unnoticed, as Captain Hay acknowledged that their torpedoes had nearly struck their target. The German sailors displayed both honor and admiration for the Glowworm's crew, acknowledging the fierceness of the battle and caring for the survivors. After the incident, Hipper headed to Trondheim, while Glowworm disappeared beneath the waves. Remarkably, Captain Hay did something unprecedented, sending a carefully worded message through the International Red Cross to the British Admiralty. In this message, he recommended Gerard Broadmead Roop for the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest decoration for war. In July 1945, The London Gazette, the government's official organ, announced the award of the Victoria Cross to Gerard Broadmead Roop. Lieutenant Ramsay received the Distinguished Service Order, and 3 enlisted men, including Petty Officer Scott, were awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal. Only 31 men survived the epic encounter. Sunlight painted a serene picture across the Pacific's waters as sailors exchanged stories and laughs over morning cigarettes. The tranquil scene was disrupted by a distant growling hum, the unmistakable drone of approaching aircraft. Pearl Harbor sailors could not have imagined the horror they were about to experience when their calm morning was abruptly torn apart. Metallic shrieks and the roar of exploding bombs thundered all around them. The imposing USS West Virginia quickly found herself in the crosshairs, assailed by a barrage of bombs and torpedoes that ripped through her sturdy decks. Ash-covered sailors fought bravely against the flames' relentless advance. Water roared in through torn steel, while desperate hands tried stemming the flood, their fingers raw and bloodied. The pungent tang of burning salt water, oil, and seared flesh created a dreadful experience that would haunt the battleship's survivors for the rest of their lives. Gunners fired skyward at the swarm of Japanese warplanes, even as the West Virginia groaned and shuddered. But in the end, even her valiant resistance wasn't enough. The once proud West Virginia succumbed, settling mournfully into the harbor's shallow embrace. But like the American spirit, the colossal warship would rise again. Before the war was over, it would bring vengeance to those who had sunk her. The USS West Virginia stood as the crowning achievement of the Colorado-class of American battleships, an iconic lineage crafted to command the seas in the early decades of the 20th century. The Colorado-class was a milestone in the trajectory of American naval design. While they drew inspiration from the earlier Tennessee-class, they were notably superior in several respects. The primary distinction lay in their firepower. The Colorado-class boasted 8 imposing 16-inch guns, elevating them above the 14-inch guns found in prior classes. This significant armament placed them in a select league, with few contemporaries, such as Britain's Nelson-class, matching their firepower. In crafting these vessels, an emphasis was placed on resilience. Enhanced armor, particularly guarding essential regions like the magazines and engine compartments, was a nod to the escalating potency of naval guns. The objective was clear: ensure these battleships could endure onslaughts from adversary ships of their caliber. Though innovative in many aspects, the Colorado-class still echoed many design elements of the Tennessee-class, drawing some critiques. A faction within naval circles contended that a more radical departure in design could have led to a groundbreaking class. Yet, the U.S. Navy's vision was clear. They were evolving toward a uniform battleship paradigm. By maintaining consistency in characteristics such as speed, weaponry, and protection across the same class, they aimed to streamline logistics, training, and tactics, a crucial consideration for potential global confrontations. Constructed with the might of a fortress and armed with fearsome firepower, the USS West Virginia's keel was set on April 12, 1920, and she was officially brought into service on December 1, 1923. Emblematic of the naval supremacy of her era, she was an apex predator. However, as the world edged closer to another global conflict, this representative of the Colorado-class would find herself navigating waters filled with emerging and potent adversaries. The years leading up to World War II saw the USS West Virginia, affectionately termed the WV by her crew, enjoying peace and calm, albeit with significant events. At the helm during its first voyages was Captain Thomas J. Senn. Shortly after her maiden voyage, West Virginia faced a daunting challenge. As she navigated the Lynnhaven Channel, mechanical difficulties led her to run aground, casting a shadow of embarrassment over the crew and their captain. However, this mishap was later attributed to flawed navigational data, ensuring Captain Senn and the ship's navigator were spared the ignominy. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, West Virginia became a distinguished participant in numerous naval exercises organized by the U.S. Navy during the interwar years. Often termed as fleet problems, these trials and maneuvers spanned across the globe, from the chilly waters of Alaska to the tropical confines of Panama. In 1925, under the astute leadership of Captain Arthur Jaffe Hepburn, the ship outshone its peers in a gunnery contest, earning the revered Battle Efficiency Ribbon. West Virginia's saga of achievements continued. In 1927, 1932, and 1933, she encountered simulated damages during fleet exercises. First from aircraft hailing from the carrier Lexington, and later due to a tragic case of friendly fire when the Saratoga was mistakenly identified as a foe. As Europe's political atmosphere grew tense during the 1930s, West Virginia underwent subtle modifications. These included upgrades to her anti-aircraft guns and the addition of aircraft catapults. Though there were discussions about a comprehensive modernization of the vessel, the financial implications and the advent of technologically superior battleships rendered these plans moot. Newer warships enjoyed the cutting-edge equipment, while battleships like West Virginia grappled with obsolescence, improvising as they gradually faded into the annals of history. As storm clouds of World War II gathered, the emphasis pivoted towards ramping up anti-aircraft defenses. While numerous modifications were envisioned for West Virginia, the impending war meant only a handful saw the light of day. By the close of 1941, the Navy engaged in fervent preparations, with the threat of conflict with Japan looming large. They hastened to bolster the anti-aircraft prowess of their armada. Even West Virginia, in her fading glory, received some makeshift enhancements. However, as fate would have it, these measures would fall tragically short. In the early morning of December 7, 1941, the USS West Virginia stood tall at Battleship Row in Pearl Harbor, right next to the Tennessee. But just before 8 a.m., the morning sun was darkened with Japanese aircraft, unleashing a merciless surprise assault that would forever live in infamy. To the Japanese strategists, battleships like the West Virginia were primary targets, second only to aircraft carriers. With the carriers absent, the attackers shifted their focus to the battleships, cornerstone assets of American naval power. West Virginia was in the line of fire immediately. 7 torpedoes slammed into her port side, while bombers from above dropped 2 heavy bombs onto her deck. The first bomb breached the port side, igniting intense fires below. The second hit the rear turret. Though it didn't detonate, the impact was devastating, destroying a gun and damaging 2 onboard planes. Gasoline from one of these planes spilled out, fueling a raging fire on the deck. Torpedoes continued their assault. Some caused significant hull damage, while others impacted her rudder. The sailors, though caught off guard, reacted instinctively, seeking cover, manning weaponry, or assisting wounded shipmates. Noticing the ship dangerously listing, Lieutenant Claude V. Ricketts and his team took immediate action. They counter-flooded sections of West Virginia to prevent her from capsizing, a fate suffered by the nearby USS Oklahoma. And even when encroaching fires from the USS Arizona necessitated an evacuation, Ricketts and his crew persevered in their firefighting efforts. During this turmoil, Captain Mervyn S. Bennion was critically injured by bomb fragments. Despite his wounds, he continued to lead and inspire his crew. For his valiant efforts, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Meanwhile, though untrained on the weapon, Doris Miller courageously manned an anti-aircraft gun, trying to repel the relentless Japanese aircraft. His heroics would earn him the Navy Cross. But despite the bravery and efforts of her crew, the West Virginia, damaged and ablaze, slowly settled into the harbor. By the next dawn, the fires had been extinguished. The tragic tally was 106 sailors lost, and the mighty ship seemed defeated by the Japanese onslaught. However, the tale of West Virginia was far from its conclusion. The savage attack dealt a stinging blow to America's naval prestige. 4 of the 8 mighty battleships docked at Pearl Harbor were sent to the sea floor, and 4 others took serious damage, with only USS Pennsylvania emerging with minor scars. In the haunting days that followed, rescue crews heard muffled, desperate thumps from within the submerged hulls of ships like the West Virginia. It was a grim signal from trapped sailors below. There was a mixture of anger and helplessness for rescuers, knowing comrades were confined within the hull beyond their reach. The aftermath presented a chaotic scene for the U.S. Navy. Sunken and flaming ships, water aflame with spilled oil, looming threats of more attacks, and many urgent challenges. There was a tangible fear that cutting open the hulls for rescue could either inundate the ships or trigger catastrophic explosions. Guard duty near West Virginia became a dreaded assignment. The faint, persistent cries for help emanating from within were unbearable on hushed nights. As one sailor confided to his friend, quote, "God, I can't go by that ship anymore." The toll of 2,335 lives lost, another 1,143 wounded, the sting of the surprise attack, and the chilling echoes from West Virginia galvanized many U.S. servicemen. They thirsted for retribution. But with a battered Navy, prospects of a swift naval counteroffensive seemed distant. The fleet was critically short on warships, especially battleships, but the U.S. wasn't about to idly stand by. They set out to raise their fallen giants from Pearl Harbor's shallow depths, intent on channeling them as instruments of vengeance against the Japanese. Repairs commenced, starting with sealing the gaping torpedo punctures, and by May 17, 1942, the West Virginia was refloated. A meticulous examination in the dry dock uncovered 7 torpedo hits, which was a number surpassing earlier assessments. During these early repair stages, heartbreaking discoveries were made. The 66 to 70 lifeless sailors trapped in the submerged decks were retrieved. Some had endured for days, subsisting on emergency rations and dwindling freshwater supplies before succumbing to their injuries, dehydration, or hunger. As the Navy pondered on the extent to which the older battleships should be modernized, both the West Virginia and the California, having sustained severe damage at Pearl Harbor, were marked for comprehensive refurbishments. West Virginia was now slated to receive the crucial upgrades she had long been deprived of. The revamp encompassed the addition of torpedo bulges, state-of-the-art weapons, and advanced radar systems. The ship's superstructure was significantly transformed, with critical components like the conning tower being either overhauled or replaced altogether. Cutting-edge air search and fire control radars were fitted, and her arsenal underwent a substantial upgrade, featuring an array of new firearms. By early July 1944, with the Pacific conflict intensifying, West Virginia was primed for sea trials. Following successful evaluations, she embarked on a shakedown cruise, setting course for Hawaii in September, flanked by 2 destroyers. Upon her arrival, she became part of Battleship Division 4. Later, in October, she proudly took on the role of the flagship for Rear Admiral Theodore D. Ruddock, prepping for operations in the Philippines. Her rebirth had been a lengthy endeavor, spanning nearly 3 years. Still, the revamped West Virginia was ready to exact revenge for the devastation at Pearl Harbor. Assigned to the bustling Pacific Theater during the height of the war, the rejuvenated West Virginia found herself at the forefront of many battles. Now armed with the latest advancements, this revitalized giant was on a mission to see the war through. Her defining hour was at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in 1944, recognized as one of the most monumental naval engagements ever. As a key asset of the 7th Fleet, West Virginia met the Japanese center force head-on in the Surigao Strait. Alongside fellow American battleships, they formed an imposing barrier to halt the enemy's progress. With the Shroud of Night as her ally and her state-of-the-art radar guiding her, the WV unleashed a barrage on the encroaching Japanese fleet. This relentless assault, coupled with the torpedoes dispatched by American destroyers, crippled the opposition, tipping the scales of the battle. The moment bore deep symbolism. Several American ships, including West Virginia, once victimized at Pearl Harbor, now stood as avengers. Adding to the poetic justice, the Japanese battleship Yamashiro met its demise during this clash. This ship had played a role in the Pearl Harbor devastation. The waters of the Surigao Strait bore witness to the WV exacting her vengeance. Later, West Virginia played a pivotal role at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, offering invaluable naval gunfire support. Her formidable guns obliterated enemy defenses, reinforcing the efforts of the ground forces. During the Battle of Okinawa, with kamikaze pilots descending in fury, the WV again demonstrated her mettle, fending off multiple strikes. Yet, during the war's final act, the USS West Virginia found her redemption. Anchored in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, she looked on as Japan formally surrendered aboard the USS Missouri. From her tragic descent at Pearl Harbor to standing tall in Tokyo Bay, West Virginia's odyssey mirrored the indomitable American spirit, marking the lengths brave souls would go to right the wrongs of December 7, 1941.